The evening watch began in the way it always began, with the gradual fading of light so slow you could not mark the moment day surrendered to night. You stood at the edge of the camp where the trampled grass gave way to an open field that stretched toward a distant line of poplars, their forms now reduced to dark, vertical smudges against a sky of unbroken grey. The rain had been falling since mid-afternoon, a steady, patient downpour that never grew heavier or lighter, its sound a constant soft hiss across the canvas tents behind you, and a gentle splashing where drops struck the puddled mud at your feet. You wore a heavy wool cloak over your breastplate, the fibers already saturated with moisture, so that the garment hung heavier on your shoulders than it had when you first put it on. A Morian helmet sat on your head, its curved brim channeling thin rivulets of water down the back of your neck, where they traced slow cold lines along your skin before soaking into the collar of your doublet. In your hands, cradled across your chest with the stock resting against your hip, you held an arquebus, the match cord kept carefully dry beneath the shelter of your arm, its faint acrid smell of saltpeter mixing with the cleaner scent of rain. You did not move for a long while, and the world around you seemed to hold its breath in sympathy. The only visible movement, the constant downward drift of raindrops through the dim air. A lantern hung from a pole a few paces to your left, its flame a small orange globe that cast a wavering circle of light onto the mud and made the puddles gleam like sheets of polished tin. Beyond that circle the darkness gathered in layers, the nearest tents visible as pale humped shapes, the distant ones swallowed entirely. You shifted your weight from one leg to the other, a motion so habitual it required no thought, and felt the mud beneath your right boot give slightly with a wet sucking sound that was immediately covered by the rain. Your leather shoes, already dark with water, sank into the soft earth until the mud reached the stitching along the sides, and when you lifted a foot to reposition it, the ground released it with a reluctance you could feel in the strain of your ankle. Time passed without measure, marked only by the slow accumulation of small sensations. The cold seeped gradually into your fingers, inside your damp gloves, turning your grip on the arquebus stock into something stiff and deliberate. A droplet formed on the tip of your nose, hung there for several seconds while you contemplated its tickling presence, and then fell away without ceremony. From somewhere behind you came the muffled cough of a soldier inside a tent, the sound dampened by wet canvas into something soft and unremarkable. You listened to it fade, and then listened to the rain again, its rhythm so unchanging that after a while you stopped hearing it consciously, the sound becoming a kind of silence in its own right, a blanket of noise that smoothed over all the smaller sounds of the camp. The air smelled of wet earth and old canvas and the faintly metallic tang of the armor oil you had applied to your breastplate that morning. Beneath those smells lay something deeper and richer, the dark organic scent of soil that had been waterlogged for weeks, a smell that spoke of slow decay and the patient turning of seasons. You inhaled without thinking, and then exhaled, your breath a small cloud of vapor that merged with the rain and vanished. The cold air made the inside of your nose prickle, and you rubbed it absently with the back of a wet glove, the rough wool scraping gently against your skin. You looked out across the field again, scanning the darkness with the slow, methodical attention of a man who expected to see nothing and was content to confirm that expectation. The poplars had disappeared entirely now, swallowed by the night and the rain, and the field was a featureless expanse of blackness that seemed to stretch without end. A single raindrop struck the brim of your helmet directly above your left eye, the tiny impact vibrating through the metal and into your skull as a faint ping that was more felt than heard. You blinked and looked down at the puddle nearest your right foot, watching the raindrops crater its surface in an endless repetition of identical circles that expanded and vanished and were replaced before they could complete themselves. The lantern flame flickered once, a brief flutter that sent shadows dancing across the mud and then steadied again. A drop of water had found its way through the oiled paper that shielded the flame, and you heard the brief hiss of its extinction, a sound so small it was almost not a sound at all. The lantern keeper would relight it on his next round, but until then the circle of light contracted and the darkness pressed a little closer. You did not mind the darkness, having stood enough watches to know that it was simply another condition of the world. like the rain or the cold, a thing to be accepted rather than opposed. Your thoughts drifted without direction, pulled by gentle currents of association. You remembered for no particular reason the way the afternoon light fell across the stone floor of your family's house in Toledo, the warm golden color it made on the gray flagstones, the dust motes spinning slowly in the beam. The memory was so distant it felt borrowed, a scene from someone else's life that had been placed in your keeping for safekeeping. You let it sit in your mind for a while, examining its edges with a mild curiosity, and then you let it go, and it dissolved back into the rain and the darkness from which it had come. A sound reached you, low and rhythmic, and you identified it after a moment as the creaking of a leather strap somewhere in the dark to your right. The sound repeated at long, irregular intervals, the strap rubbing against wood or metal, and you pictured a supply wagon with its tarpaulin drawn tight, one of its tie-downs working loose in the wet. The image was so clear you could almost see the dark water beading on the stretched canvas, the way the rope fibers swelled with moisture, the wooden frame dark and slick. The creaking continued for several minutes, a companionable sound, and then it stopped, and you were alone with the rain again. You stamped to feet once, twice, the motion sending small jolts of sensation up through your legs and chasing away the stiffness that had begun to settle in your knees. The mud splashed softly around your ankles, and you felt a tiny satisfaction in the simple act of moving, a satisfaction that was not happiness, but rather the absence of discomfort for a brief moment. Then you settled back into stillness, and the cold resumed its slow advance, creeping up from the ground through the soles of your boots, sinking down from the air through the damp layers of your clothing. The rain continued, never changing its pace, and you listened to the different sounds it made as it struck different surfaces. On the canvas of the nearest tent it produced a low drumming, a continuous murmur that rose and fell with no pattern you could discern. On the puddles it made a pattering sound, lighter and higher, a scatter of small impacts that merged into a single wash of noise. On the brim of your helmet it tapped with individual droplets, each one a distinct click that separated itself from the background hiss. On the ground directly beside you, where the mud was thickest, it fell almost silently, the drops absorbed into the saturated earth with only the faintest wet sound. You catalogued these variations without effort, your ears sorting them as a matter of course, and then you let the whole complex of sound recede into the background of your awareness, a backdrop against which all other things occurred. The camp behind you was a quiet place, its usual daytime noises long since settled into the deep hush of the sleeping hours. You knew without looking that the cook's fires had been doused, the embers blackening under the rain, and that the men in the tents lay wrapped in their blankets, their breathing slow and even. You knew that the sentry at the opposite end of the perimeter stood in a similar pool of lantern light, watching a similar field of darkness, listening to the same rain. The knowledge was a comfort of sorts, the awareness that you were not the only wakeful thing in this wet night, and you held it in your mind briefly before releasing it. A horse blew air through its nostrils somewhere in the picket line, a soft chuffing sound that was heavy and warm and entirely alive. The sound made you aware of the animals standing in the rain, their heads lowered, their coats dark with water, accepting the weather with the same patient endurance that you brought to your watch. You imagined the steam rising from their flanks, the way their ears twitched at the small sounds of the night, the slow blinking of their large dark eyes. The image lingered for a while, and then you returned your attention to the field before you, which had not changed in any way. Your arquebus grew heavier in your arms, the weight of it a familiar pressure against your chest and hip. The match cord, still dry beneath your sleeve, gave off its sharp smell again, and you shifted it slightly to ensure no water found its way to the smouldering tip. The mechanism of the matchlock was a simple thing, a curved serpentine that would lower the burning cord into the priming pan when you pulled the trigger, but you did not think about the mechanics of firing or the sequence of actions required to load the weapon, because there was no reason to fire it, no target in the darkness, no threat in the rain. The arquebus was simply an object you carried, like the helmet or the cloak, a part of the equipment of watchfulness. You noticed without any sense of urgency that the rain had begun to fall at a slight angle now, driven by a breeze so gentle you could barely feel it on your cheek. The angle was enough to send droplets under the brim of your helmet, and you felt them strike the side of your face with the softness of a feather's touch. One drop near your temple, another on your jaw, a third tracing a line down your cheekbone. The breeze carried with it the faint scent of wet leaves from the distant trees, a green smell that cut through the earthy odors of the camp and reminded you that beyond the perimeter there was a world of hedgerows and ditches and flooded meadows, all of them silent and dark and utterly indifferent to your presence. You thought about the morning, which was still many hours away, and about the thin grey light that would eventually seep back into the sky, revealing the outlines of things that were now hidden. The process would be so slow that you would not notice it happening, the darkness giving way to a lesser darkness, and then to a pale wash of illumination that was not yet day. The poplars would reappear first as faint vertical lines, then as solid forms, and the field would become a flat expanse of brown water and green shoots. The tents would resume their daytime shapes, and the camp would begin to stir with the small sounds of men waking, the rattle of cookpots, the murmur of voices. You knew all of this without anticipation, simply as a fact of the world, a sequence that had occurred on every previous morning of your service, and would occur on every morning to come. Another cough sounded from the tents, different from the first, a dry, rasping cough that went on for several seconds and then subsided. You heard the rustle of a blanket, the murmur of a voice saying something unintelligible, and then silence again. The rain filled the space the sounds had left, its steady presence erasing the memory of the interruption, so that after a short while you could not recall whether you had actually heard a cough or merely imagined it. You shifted your weight again, this time leaning your shoulder against the rough wooden post of the lantern stand. The post was wet and slick under your touch, its surface grooved with age and weather, and it creaked slightly as you rested against it. The flame above your head continued to burn, its light casting your shadow forward onto the mud, a long dark shape that stretched away from your feet and disappeared into the puddles. You watched the shadow without interest, seeing how it wavered when the lantern swayed in the breeze, how its edges blurred in the rain. The shadow was a version of yourself, simplified and flattened, a dark shape that stood guard over a dark field, and you felt a mild kinship with it, the way you might feel a mild kinship with the horse that blew air through its nostrils, or the sentry at the far end of the camp. Time continued to pass, the minutes sliding into one another without distinction. You did not count them, having long ago learned that counting the hours of a watch only made them longer, stretching each moment into a small eternity of waiting. Instead, you let the time pass over you like the rain, accepting its passage with the same passive attention you gave to the cold and the darkness. Your mind drifted again, touching briefly on the memory of a meal you had eaten 2 days earlier, a thick stew of beans and salt pork that had left a film of grease on the bowl, and then moving on to the image of a road winding through brown hills, a road you had marched along the previous week, your boots raising puffs of dust that were now entirely unimaginable in this world of water and mud. The images came and went, none of them demanding attention, all of them dissolving back into the rain sound that filled your ears. You noticed that the rain had formed a small channel in the mud near your left foot, a miniature river that carried water from a puddle toward a lower depression several paces away. The channel was no wider than your finger, its banks smooth and dark, and you watched the water flow through it with the quiet purposefulness of all water everywhere. A single blade of grass, bent and flattened, lay across the channel, and the water parted around it and rejoined itself on the other side, a tiny disruption that changed nothing. You watched this for what might have been minutes, or might have been much longer. The small flow holding your attention with its gentle motion. The cold had by now penetrated through your cloak and doublet, reaching the skin of your arms and chest, and you felt it as a constant low ache that was not quite discomfort, but rather a background condition of existence. You thought about the blanket in your tent, the rough wool that would feel warm if you were to wrap yourself in it, and you imagined the texture of it against your cheek, the faint smell of lanolin and straw. The thought was not longing but simply a recognition of a future state, a thing that would happen when the watch ended and you were relieved. You did not hurry toward it, because hurrying was futile, because the watch would end in its own time and not a moment before. A sound came from the field, a small splashing sound, and you turned your head slowly toward it. The darkness showed you nothing, and the sound was not repeated, and so you concluded it had been a clod of earth falling into a ditch or a small animal moving through the wet grass. The conclusion required no effort and provoked no alarm, simply the quiet filing of information in a mind that had catalogued many such small sounds and found meaning in none of them. You returned your gaze to the middle distance, to the place where the lantern light met the darkness, and you waited. The rain continued to fall, and you continued to stand, and the night continued to move in its slow circuit toward the morning. The lantern flame burned steadily, the mud absorbed the water, the tents dripped, the horses stood in their patient silence, and the soldier named you kept watch over all of it, a motionless figure in the wet darkness, asking nothing and expecting nothing, simply present in the way that rain is present or cold is present, a part of the night that had not yet passed. The sound of the rain on canvas was a thing you could feel as much as hear, a low, continuous murmur that seemed to press against your ears like the weight of a heavy blanket. Every tent in the camp contributed its own voice to this chorus, hundreds of stretched surfaces receiving the same endless fall of water, and the combined effect was a deep drone that hovered at the very edge of sound, a vibration so constant it became almost a silence after long exposure. You stood at your post with your back to the nearest row of tents, and the canvas murmured behind you with the patient regularity of a breathing creature, inhaling and exhaling in a rhythm that never varied. The sound was deeper where the fabric sagged under collected water, and lighter where it was drawn tight over its poles, and you could trace the shape of each tent by the quality of its rain voice, the way a blind man might trace a face with his fingertips. Droplets struck the brim of your helmet with a different note entirely, a series of small hard clicks that punctuated the background drone. Each impact was a tiny event that lasted a fraction of a second, the water hitting the metal and then sliding off to join the general wetness of the world. The clicks came at irregular intervals, faster when a gust of wind shook the rain sideways, slower when the air was still, and you found yourself listening for them without intention, your ears picking out the sharp sounds from the wash of softer noise. A droplet that landed precisely on the crest of your helmet produced a ringing note, faint and musical, while one that struck the brim near your temple produced a duller thud, the metal there being closer to your skull and transmitting the vibration directly into bone. You noticed these distinctions without cataloguing them, the way you noticed the different shades of grey in the night sky without thinking about the color grey. Water slid from the edges of your wool cloak in slow drips, and you heard those too. The cloak had absorbed as much moisture as it could hold, and the excess ran down the coarse fibers to gather at the hem, where it formed beads that hung for a moment and then released themselves. Each drop fell a short distance to the mud below, landing with a sound so soft it was barely a sound at all, a tiny wet tick that repeated itself every few seconds. The mud around your feet was already so saturated that the drops made no splash, simply merging into the puddled ground with a faint giving way, the earth accepting water, the way a sponge accepts water, silently and without resistance. The puddles themselves played a higher music, the raindrops striking their surfaces with a pattering that seemed to come from all directions at once. Unlike the canvas drone or the helmet clicks, the puddle sounds had a liquid quality, each impact a small hollow pop that echoed briefly in the miniature basin before fading. When a drop fell into a puddle directly beside your boot, you heard the ring of spreading ripples, a subtle washing sound that lasted only a heartbeat. The puddles were of different sizes and depths, and each produced its own note depending on those dimensions, so that the ground around you was an orchestra of tiny water sounds, each puddle singing in its own voice. You did not count them or name them, but your ears received them all, sorting the chorus into a single texture that was as familiar as your own breathing. Beneath the rain and the drips and the puddle pattering, the camp held a deeper stillness, a silence that was not the absence of sound, but rather the presence of a great quiet that surrounded and contained all the small noises. This silence was made of sleeping men and banked fires and the patient waiting of animals, a quiet that had weight and substance, a thing you could lean into. It filled the spaces between the tents, the dark corridors where no lanterns hung, and it rose from the soaked earth like a mist. You stood inside the silence as you stood inside your cloak, wrapped in it, and it muffled the world as effectively as any snowfall. The first sound that separated itself from the rain was the creak of leather somewhere in the darkness to your right. It came at long intervals, a low groaning stretch that repeated 2 or 3 times and then fell silent for minutes before resuming. You knew the sound to be a harness strap on one of the supply wagons, a length of oiled leather that had absorbed water and was now rubbing against a wooden frame as the wagon settled into the mud under its own weight. The creak had a voice like an old door, slow and reluctant, and it came from a specific location that you could pinpoint by turning your head slightly, though you did not need to see the wagon to confirm its presence. The sound told you everything: the weight of the load, the softness of the ground, the slow, patient decay of a knot, working loose one fiber at a time. A different sound followed, metallic this time, the faint clink of a pike shaft accidentally touching another. The noise was small and sharp, a single note of iron against iron that cut through the rain drone and then was gone. You pictured the 2 sentries of the far perimeter, shifting their grips on their weapons, one man's pike head brushing the others in the dark. A murmured apology would have followed, too quiet to carry across the distance, and then stillness again. The metal of the pikes would be cold and wet, the water beading on the steel and running down the wooden shafts to soak into the ground. You had held such a pike yourself on other watches, and you remembered the way the wood grew slippery after hours of rain, the way the grain raced slightly under your palms, the way the iron smelled faintly of rust even through the clean scent of water. From the picket line came the sound of a horse blowing air through its nostrils, a soft chuff that was warm and alive and entirely unlike the mechanical noises of the camp. The animal was probably shaking its head, its mane heavy with water, its ears twitching at the small sounds of the night. You heard the stamp of a hoof in mud, a single dull thud, and then the jingle of a halter ring as the horse settled back into its patient immobility. The horses stood in the rain without complaint, their great bodies giving off steam in the cold air, and their presence was a comfort, the knowledge that other living things shared this wet darkness with you. A voice murmured somewhere behind you, too low for words, and then another voice answered, and then silence. The 2 voices were like stones dropped into a pond, their ripples spreading outward and then smoothing away into the greater stillness. You did not know what had been said, and you did not need to know, because the words were not meant for you, and because the simple sound of human speech was enough, a reminder that you were part of a community of men who shared the same mud and the same rain and the same patient endurance of the long Flemish night. The rain continued to fall, and you continued to stand, and the small sounds of the camp rose and fell around you like the breathing of a single large creature. The canvas murmured, the puddles pattered, the leather creaked, the horses chuffed, the voices whispered and faded, and beneath it all, the deep silence held everything together, a container for all the tiny noises of the night. You let your awareness drift among these sounds, not focusing on any one of them, not ignoring any of them, simply receiving them as they came, a listener in the dark. The cold was still present, the weight of the arquebus was still present, the rough wool of the cloak was still present, but they had become parts of the background too, sensations that were so constant they no longer registered as anything more than the conditions of existence. You breathed in the scent of wet canvas and wet earth. You felt the rain on your face. You heard the music of the camp, and you waited, because waiting was the work of the watch. A drop of water fell from the center pole of the nearest tent and landed on a taut guy rope, producing a single clear note that vibrated for a moment and then faded. The note was pure and musical, unlike the percussive sounds of the rain, and it seemed to hang in the air longer than it should, a small gift of unexpected beauty in the midst of the monotonous night. You listened to it die away, and then listened to the silence it left behind, a silence that was quickly filled by the rain's return to the foreground of your attention. The rain was always there, always waiting, its patience greater than yours, its presence as constant as the earth itself. You thought about the men sleeping in the tents, the way their dreams carried them away from the cold and the wet, the way their bodies rested and restored themselves for the next day's duties. You envied them not their sleep, but their temporary escape from awareness, the way they had set down the burden of watching and let the night pass without their attendance. But your envy was a mild thing, a fleeting shadow of a feeling, because you knew that your turn to sleep would come, that the watch would end and another man would take your place, and you would lie down in the damp straw and close your eyes and let the rain sing you into oblivion. The knowledge was enough, a small, quiet certainty that made the present moment bearable and even, in some strange way, pleasant. The rain began to ease slightly, the drops growing smaller and more numerous, the heavy drumming on the canvas giving way to a lighter, more diffuse patter. The change was subtle, and you might not have noticed it if you had not been listening so intently to the world of sound around you. The canvas murmured in a softer voice now, the puddles chimed with a higher note, the drips from your cloak came more slowly. The easing of the rain was not a cessation, not a promise of clearing skies, simply a shift in the endless variations of wet weather, a small mercy that you accepted without gratitude, because the rain would return, if not tonight, then tomorrow, if not tomorrow, then the day after. Rain was the default condition of this country, and you had long since stopped expecting anything else. The night wore on, and the sounds of the camp grew fewer and farther between. The horses settled into a deeper stillness. The leather creaked less often. The voices faded entirely. The only constant was the rain, still falling, still pattering, still murmuring, its voice the voice of the world itself. You stood in the center of that voice, wrapped in it, and you felt a strange, quiet peace settle over you, a peace that had nothing to do with happiness or comfort, but was simply the absence of struggle, the acceptance of the moment, exactly as it was. The watch would end, the rain would fall, the morning would come, and you would still be here, a soldier in a wet field in Flanders, doing the only thing that was asked of you, standing still and listening to the rain. The captain had spoken a few quiet words near the cook's doused fire pit, words so soft they were almost lost to the rain, and you had understood that it was time to walk the inner circuit. The order required no reply beyond a slight nod, and then you were moving, leaving the stationary post by the lantern and stepping out into the deeper darkness between the tents. The ground underfoot was a mixture of churned mud and flattened grass that had been trodden into a broad path by the passage of many feet, and as you began to walk, your boots made a steady wet sound that seemed to keep time with the dripping of the canvas overhead. The rain had not lessened, but once you were away from the lantern's immediate circle of light, the night closed around you, leaving only the sense of your own movement and the guidance of a route you knew so well you could have walked it with your eyes shut. The circuit was a loop that wound between the rows of tents, past the supply wagons, around the edge of the picket line, and back to the eastern corner of the camp where a second lantern marked the far sentry post. You set out along it without haste, your pace measured and even, the arquebus now cradled in both arms with the barrel pointing down toward the ground. The wool of your cloak had grown so heavy with water that it pulled at your shoulders with a gentle, constant pressure, and you adjusted its folds once, a habitual gesture that made no real difference. The first tent you passed was a larger one, its roof sagging slightly under the accumulated weight of rain, and from inside came the deep, regular breathing of several men asleep, a sound so soft it was almost imagined. You walked on, and the breathing faded behind you, replaced by the subtle hiss of rain striking a stack of pikes that had been leaned upright against a wooden frame. The metal points caught the faintest reflection of some distant light source and glimmered for a moment, a row of tiny pale dots, and then you were past them, your attention already moving to the next familiar landmark. The path curved slightly to the left, skirting a depression in the ground that had filled with water and become a broad, shallow pond. In the daylight, this pond reflected the grey sky, but now it was a dark surface that revealed nothing, a blankness that seemed to hold no depth. You stepped around its edge, feeling the ground grow softer and more yielding where the water had seeped sideways into the path, and your left boot sank a little deeper than you had expected, the mud closing around the sole with a quiet glottal sound. You pulled free without breaking stride and continued on, the path straightening again as it led between two rows of smaller tents that faced each other across the narrow lane. The space between them was just wide enough for two men to pass, and the canvas walls on either side brushed against your shoulders as you walked, leaving streaks of moisture on the already sodden wool of your cloak. Each tent was identical to its neighbor, the same low shape, the same dark color, the same subtle smell of damp cloth and straw and tired men, and you passed them one after another without counting, their sameness a comfort rather than a confusion. At the end of the row, the lane opened into a wider area where the ground had been cleared for a small parade square, now a flat expanse of mud, crisscrossed with the ruts of wagon wheels. The rain fell here with an open sound, no canvas to break its descent, and you walked across it with your head lowered slightly, feeling the drops strike the crown of your helmet in a rapid staccato. The wagon tracks had filled with water, forming long parallel puddles that gleamed like strips of black glass, and you stepped over them carefully, the motion automatic. On the far side of the square stood a single barrel that had been placed to collect rainwater for the horses, and as you drew near you heard the distinctive sound of water overflowing its rim, a thin trickle that splashed into the mud below. You paused beside the barrel for a moment, not because you needed to rest, but because the circuit had a rhythm that included brief pauses, points where the watchman might stop and listen before continuing. You listened now, hearing the trickle of the barrel, the distant murmur of rain on canvas, and, faintly, the lowing of an ox from somewhere beyond the wagons. The sound was so deep and slow it seemed to belong to the earth itself, and you held it in your awareness for a full breath before moving on. The path now led you past the supply wagons, 3 of them parked in a row with their tongues resting on the ground and their canvas covers lashed tight over heaped shapes that in the darkness could have been sacks of grain or folded tents or anything at all. A rope had come loose from the second wagon, and its end swayed gently in the breeze, making a soft brushing sound against the wooden sideboard with each swing. You noticed it without stopping, noting that someone would secure it in the morning, and then you were beyond the wagons and entering the area where the horses stood. The picket line was a long rope stretched between 2 posts, and along it the animals were spaced at even intervals, their heads lowered and their bodies motionless. The smell here was stronger, the warm animal scent of wet hide and manure mixing with the clean smell of rain, and he heard again the soft chuffing of a horse's breath, closer now, accompanied by the faint creak of leather as the animal shifted its weight. One of the horses raised its head as you passed, and you saw the pale gleam of an eye catching a sliver of light from somewhere, a brief recognition that vanished as the head lowered again. You walked past them all, your boots making less noise now on the straw-strewn ground, and the horses paid you no further attention. The path bent again, turning back toward the center of the camp, and you passed a small tent that served as the armorer's workspace, its entrance flap tied shut and its walls dark. A faint metallic smell lingered around it, the residue of oil and steel, and the fine dust of a whetstone, and you inhaled it briefly before the rain washed it away. Beyond the armorer's tent, the ground rose slightly, a low mound that was the highest point within the perimeter, and as you climbed it, you felt the mud grow thinner, the grass tougher underfoot. From this small elevation, you could see the camp laid out below you, a collection of dark shapes and occasional glimmers of lantern light that seemed to float in the wet air like captive stars. You stood there for a while, the rain striking your back now that you had turned into the breeze, and you surveyed the scene with the slow, methodical attention of a man who had looked upon it many times before and found nothing new, but who still looked, because looking was the work of the watch. The lantern at the eastern corner was visible from here, a single yellow point of light that marked the position of the other sentry. You knew the man who stood there, a soldier named Miguel who came from a village near Salamanca, and who rarely spoke more than a handful of words during an entire watch. The distance between the 2 lanterns was not great, perhaps 200 paces, but in the darkness it felt like a vast interval, a gulf of night and rain that separated you from the only other wakeful presence in the world. You lifted a hand, a small gesture of acknowledgement that you knew would not be seen, and then you descended the mound and rejoined the main path, your boots squelching again as you stepped back into the mud. The circuit now took you along the rear of the camp, where the tents were sparser and the ground was rougher, dotted with clumps of nettles and low shrubs that had not been cleared. Here the rain had gathered in deeper puddles, and you navigated around them by memory, knowing without seeing where the ground was firm and where it would give way. A small ditch ran parallel to the path, its existence betrayed only by the sound of water moving through it, a low gurgling that was different from the patter of rain. You followed the ditch for a distance, listening to its quiet commentary, and then the path turned again, and you were walking between the tents once more, the canvas walls returning to hem you in on both sides. A cat, one of the several that lived in the camp and kept the rats at bay, crossed the path ahead of you, its body low and sleek and dark with water. It paused to look at you, its eyes reflecting the faint light as two green sparks, and then it slicked under the wall of a tent and vanished. You did not alter your pace, and the encounter passed without significance, simply another small event in the long procession of events that made up a watch. The rain continued to fall, its sound now so constant that you had ceased to hear it as distinct from the silence, the two blending into a single condition of the night. You were approaching the starting point of the circuit now, the lantern post where you had begun, and you saw its light growing brighter as you drew near. The first circuit was complete, but the watch was not over, and so you did not stop. Instead, you turned at the post and began the loop again, retracing your steps with the same slow, measured pace. The path was already familiar from the journey just completed, and this familiarity smoothed the experience into something dreamlike, a repetition that erased the distinction between the first pass and the second. You walked past the same large tent, the same stacked pikes, the same shallow pond, and you saw them as you had seen them before, but the seeing was gentler now, less a matter of observation than of recognition, the way you recognize the features of a well-known room without needing to study them. The pond had spread slightly, its edges creeping outward as the rain continued to feed it, and you stepped a little wider to avoid the new soft ground at its margin. The stacked pikes dripped, the water running down their shafts in slow, continuous lines, and the canvas of the large tent sagged a fraction more than it had on the first pass, though you could not be certain of this. The air was cool and still, the breeze having died away entirely, and the rain fell straight down now, vertical and unhurried. Your breath formed small clouds that hung before your face for a moment and then dissolved, and you walked through them as though through the memory of yourself, a faint ghost that preceded you along the path. On this second pass, the details of the camp seemed to settle more deeply into your awareness. You noticed the way the mud had been churned into small ridges by the passage of boots earlier in the day, and how the rain was slowly erasing those ridges, smoothing the ground into a uniform surface. You noticed the faint smell of burnt wood that still lingered near the cook's fire pit, a smell that not even the rain could entirely wash away. You noticed the silence beneath the rain, the way the camp seemed to hold its breath, the absence of bird song, the absence of voices, the absence of any sound that was not made by water. These observations accumulated without effort, layer upon layer, until you carried in your mind a complete map of the camp as it existed in that moment. A map made of small sensory details rather than lines and distances. The third circuit began without ceremony, the turn at the eastern lantern post marked by a brief nod to Miguel, who returned it with a slight inclination of his helmet, the raindrops sliding off its brim in a small cascade. You did not speak, because there was nothing to say, and you resumed the path, your boots finding the same ruts and puddles they had found before. This time the walk felt even slower, the seconds stretching into longer units of time, and you became aware of your own body in a detached way, the steady rise and fall of your chest, the gentle ache in your shoulders from the weight of the arquebus, the cold that had settled into your feet and turned your toes into distant, numb things that belonged to you, but seemed far away. You observed these sensations without judgment, letting them be present without attempting to change them, and they faded into the background of the walk, becoming part of its texture. A small wind rose briefly, stirring the canvas walls of the tents and sending a shower of collected droplets from the roof of one tent onto the path ahead of you. The droplets fell in a sudden rush, a brief intensification of the rain that lasted only a second, and then the wind died and the steady rhythm resumed. You passed through the space where the droplets had fallen and felt the freshness of the disturbed air a slight coolness that touched your cheek and then was gone. The path curved, straightened, curved again, and you followed it without thought, your feet carrying you along the route with the reliability of a mechanism. The supply wagons appeared again, their dark bulk unchanged, the loose rope still swaying with the same slow, pendular motion. The horses stood as they had stood before, their heads low, their flanks rising and falling with deep, slow breaths. The ditch gurgled with the same quiet voice. The cat had not returned. The barrel continued to overflow in a thin, steady trickle. The world had become a loop, a circle that turned endlessly on itself, and you moved within it like a figure in a painting, fixed in place even as you walked. There was no urgency in this, no frustration, only the gentle, repetitive rhythm of the circuit, the sound of rain, and the quiet certainty that the night would eventually end, though not yet, not for a long while yet. You paused at the mound for the fourth time, or perhaps the fifth. You had lost count somewhere in the repetitions, and you looked out over the camp again. The lantern still glowed, the tents still hunched under their burden of water, the field beyond the perimeter still stretched away into an unseen distance. The rain had softened everything, blurring the edges of the world, and you felt a strange kinship with the darkness, a sense that you and it were engaged in the same patient waiting, the same slow passage through the hours. You stood there for a time that might have been minutes or might have been longer, and then you descended and resumed the path, your boots finding the familiar ruts, your ears filled with the familiar sound, your mind quiet and still and entirely at peace. The first sign that the watch was nearing its end came not as a sound or a spoken word, but as a subtle change in the texture of the darkness ahead. You had been standing at the lantern post for a span of time that you could not have measured, your eyes fixed on the empty field beyond the perimeter, when a patch of night to your left seemed to thicken and then shift, separating itself from the general blackness with a deliberation that was almost geological. The shape moved slowly, a darker darkness that resolved by imperceptible degrees into the outline of a man, and then into the familiar figure of Alonso, his cloak hanging heavy with water, his morion helmet catching a faint gleam from the lantern as he drew close enough for the light to find him. He emerged from the mist that had been gathering at the edges of the camp, a low white vapor that coiled around his boots and clung to the folds of his clothing, and he walked toward you with the slow, steady gait of a man who had made this same journey at this same hour on so many previous occasions that his feet knew every dip and puddle by heart. Alonso stopped a pace away, close enough that you could see the water beating on the bridge of his nose, and the way his moustache had darkened with moisture, plastered flat against his upper lip. He did not speak immediately, because speaking was not part of the ritual until the moment required it, and you did not speak either, because you understood the rhythm of these exchanges as thoroughly as you understood the rhythm of your own breathing. The two of you stood there in the rain, two soldiers occupying the same small pool of lantern light, and the silence between you was not an empty silence, but a full one, a shared acknowledgement that the torch of wakefulness was about to pass from one hand to another. The moment arrived, as it always did, without any signal more dramatic than a slight lift of Alonso's chin, and you spoke the first half of the watchword in a voice so low it was barely a murmur, the single syllable of a saint's name that had been chosen by the captain 3 days earlier and had been repeated at every change of the guard since. Alonso answered with the second half, another murmured syllable, his voice a low rumble that seemed to come from somewhere deep in his chest. The words were not secret in any meaningful sense, the whole camp knew them by now, but the ritual of their exchange was a thing that held the world together, a small ceremony that marked the orderly transfer of duty from one man to the next. You reached inside your cloak, your fingers clumsy with cold, and retrieved a scrap of paper that had grown soft and fragile from the dampness of your body heat meeting the wet air. The watchword was written on it in faded ink, the letters blurred but still legible, and you passed it to Alonso, who took it with a nod and tucked it into his own cloak without looking at it, because he already knew what it said, had known it since the captain first whispered it into the evening air. But the paper was part of the ritual, and the ritual was not to be broken. A mild sensation passed through you then, a loosening of something that had been held tight for hours, and you recognized it as relief, though it was a relief so subdued and undemonstrative that it barely deserved the name. It was not happiness, not satisfaction in any warm or glowing sense, but simply the quiet knowledge that the watch had been kept, that nothing had happened, that the camp had remained still and dark and peaceful under your gaze, and that you could now set down the burden of attention and let another carry it for a while. The feeling was similar to the sensation of removing a heavy pack after a long march, a gradual easing of pressure rather than a sudden release, and it spread through your shoulders and down your spine as you turned away from the lantern post and began the short walk toward the tents. Alonso did not watch you go, because the ritual demanded that he now fix his eyes on the field, and he did so without hesitation, settling into the position you had occupied with the same stillness you had brought to it. You did not look back because there was no need, and because looking back would have broken the clean line of the transfer, introducing an unnecessary complication into a transaction that was already complete. Instead, you walked along the muddy path between the rows of tents, your feet finding the same ruts you had followed on your circuits earlier in the night, and the rain continued to fall with its soft, unvarying persistence, tapping your helmet and soaking your cloak, and filling the air with its gentle hiss. The cook's fire pit lay along the route to your tent, a circular depression in the ground that was now a pool of dark water and sodden ash. As you passed it, you heard the faint hiss of rainwater falling onto the remains of the fire, a sound that was subtly different from the rain on canvas or the rain on mud, a sound that carried within it the memory of heat and the quiet extinction of embers. The hiss was soft and continuous, the water striking the blackened stones that ringed the pit and trickling down into the ashy water, where it raised tiny bubbles that popped with a sound too small to hear. You paused for a moment beside the pit, looking down at the dark water and the darker shapes of half-burned logs that lay submerged beneath the surface, their outlines blurred and indistinct. The smell here was acrid and clean at the same time, the sharp scent of wet charcoal mixing with the earthier smell of mud, and you inhaled it slowly, feeling the cool air move through your nostrils and into your lungs. Then you moved on, your boots squelching in the mud, and the fire pit receded into the darkness behind you, its hissing fading into the general murmur of the rain. The tent you shared with 3 other soldiers was a low structure of canvas stretched over a wooden frame, its entrance flap tied back with a length of cord that had swollen with moisture and become difficult to work. You fumbled with the knot for a moment, your fingers stiff and uncooperative, and then the cord came free, and you ducked inside, the canvas brushing against the top of your helmet with a wet, heavy sound. The interior of the tent was dark, the only light coming from the faint glow of the lantern outside that filtered through the canvas walls, reducing everything to shades of grey and black. The air inside was warmer than the air outside, warmed by the bodies of the sleeping men, and it carried a complex smell of wet wool, old straw, leather, and the faint, lingering odor of the dried fish that someone had eaten earlier in the day. You stood just inside the entrance for a moment, letting your eyes adjust to the deeper darkness, and then you moved toward the corner where your belongings were stored, stepping carefully over the sleeping forms of your companions. One of them, a man named Vargas, who snored with a low, rhythmic rattle, stirred as you passed but did not wake, his breathing altering its pattern for a single breath and then resuming its steady course. The other 2 were silent, dark mounds of blanket and straw that rose and fell almost imperceptibly. You reached your corner and lowered yourself onto a folded blanket that served as your seat and your bed, the straw inside it crackling softly as your weight settled. The blanket was damp, as everything in the tent was damp, but it was a familiar dampness, a condition you had long since accepted, and it did not trouble you. From a small canvas bag that hung from the center pole, you retrieved the evening ration that had been left for you, a piece of hard bread, roughly the size of your fist, and a tin cup that had been filled with watered wine and covered with a square of oiled cloth to keep out the rain. The bread was dark and dense, its crust hard enough that you had to press your thumb against it to test its resistance, and you knew from long experience that it would soften in the mouth if you chewed it slowly and let the moisture of your own saliva do its work. The wine was a pale red, so diluted with water that it was more the memory of wine than wine itself. And when you lifted the cloth and brought the cup to your nose, you smelled the faint, slightly sharp fragrance of the grape and the cooler, cleaner scent of rain. You took a small sip, and the liquid was cold and thin and left a faint metallic aftertaste from the tin, a taste that lingered on your tongue for a moment and then faded into nothing. You broke a piece from the bread and placed it in your mouth, and the first sensation was of resistance, the hard crust pressing against your teeth with a gritty texture that reminded you of the fine dust of a country road in summer. As you chewed, the bread began to soften, absorbing the moisture in your mouth and becoming a thick, bland paste that tasted faintly of rye and salt and nothing else. The salt was the only flavor that stood out, a small sharp note that cut through the general blandness and then vanished, leaving behind the simple earthy taste of grain. You chewed each mouthful slowly, not from any deliberate intention but because the bread required it, and the act of chewing became a kind of meditation, a slow repetitive motion that occupied your jaw and your attention and asked nothing more of you. Between bites, you sipped the watered wine and the two substances mingled in your mouth, the dry, absorbent bread soaking up the thin liquid and becoming easier to swallow. The tin cup was cold against your lips, and each sip brought that same faint metallic tang, a taste that you had once found unpleasant but had long since ceased to notice except in moments like this, when there was nothing else to occupy your mind and the small sensations of eating became the entire world. You held the cup in both hands, feeling the chill of the metal seep into your palms, and you stared at the dark canvas wall in front of you, your eyes unfocused and your thoughts drifting without direction. The rain continued outside, its sound muffled by the tent walls, but still present, a constant low drumming that wrapped around you like a blanket. Inside the tent, the only other sounds were the breathing of the sleeping men and the occasional rustle of straw as someone shifted in his sleep, small noises that rose and fell and rose again, as steady and predictable as the rain itself. A drop of water fell from the center pole where moisture had collected on the wooden surface and landed on the straw beside your foot with a tiny soft sound that was barely audible. You watched the spot where it had fallen, the dark circle of dampness that spread for a moment and then stopped, and then you looked away, your gaze returning to the canvas wall. The bread diminished slowly in your hand, each bite reducing its mass by a small amount, and you ate without hurry, pausing often to sit motionless and listen to the rain. The cold that had settled into your body during the watch was beginning to recede, replaced by a dull warmth that came from being still and sheltered, and you felt your muscles relaxing one by one, the tension draining from your shoulders and neck and jaw. Your eyelids grew heavy, not with the urgent weight of imminent sleep, but with a gentle, gradual heaviness that was pleasant to acknowledge, a reminder that rest was near and the long watch was over. When the bread was gone and the cup was empty, you set the cup aside on the straw and wiped your fingers on the damp wool of your cloak. The cloak was still wet, and the gesture accomplished little, but it was a habit, one of the many small habits that filled the empty spaces of a soldier's day. You sat for a while longer, your hands resting loosely in your lap, your breathing slow and even, and you listened to the rain as it fell on the canvas above your head, and on the mud outside and on the distant field, and on the helmet side and the distant field, and on the helmets of the sentries who still stood their posts. The rain had been falling for so long that it seemed to have become a permanent feature of the world, a thing that had always existed and would always exist, and you accepted its presence as you accepted the presence of the earth beneath you and the sky above, without question and without resistance. Vargas snored again, a louder snore this time that ended in a small wet sound, and then he rolled onto his side, and the snoring stopped. The silence that followed was deeper than before, a pocket of quiet that seemed to press against your ears, and you filled it with your own slow breathing, in and out, a rhythm that matched the rhythm of the rain. Your thoughts had become soft and indistinct, images and impressions drifting through your mind without connecting to one another, the gleam of Alonso's helmet in the lantern light, the dark water of the fire pit, the taste of salt on the bread, the way the mud had released your boot with a sucking sound on the third circuit of the watch. these fragments surfaced and sank and surfaced again, and you observed them with a detached, tranquil attention, not holding on to any of them, simply letting them pass. Eventually, the heaviness in your limbs told you that it was time to sleep, and you stretched out on the folded blanket, arranging your cloak to serve as an additional covering, though it was so wet that it probably provided more weight than warmth. You lay on your back, staring up at the dark canvas above you, and the rain drummed on it with the same steady rhythm it had maintained for hours, a rhythm that had accompanied every sleep you had taken in this country, every meal, every watch, every quiet moment between duties. The sound filled your ears and pressed gently against your consciousness, smoothing the edges of your thoughts and drawing you down toward the deep, silent water of sleep. You closed your eyes, and the darkness behind your eyelids was no different from the darkness of the tent, a uniform blackness that held no shapes and no colors, only the soft, continuous sound of rain, falling on canvas, falling on mud, falling on the fields of Flanders without end. The rain had thinned to a drizzle so fine that it no longer made a sound against the canvas, its presence detectable only as a faint cold mist that settled on your face when you turned toward the tent flap, and as a subtle glistening on the fibers of the wool blanket when a stray beam of lantern light found its way through a gap in the stitching. The deep drumming that had accompanied the earlier hours of the night had faded by slow degrees, the individual drops merging into a general dampness that hung in the air like a held breath, and in its place had come a stillness so complete that you could hear the blood moving in your ears, a distant oceanic sigh that rose and fell with each beat of your heart. You lay on your straw pallet with your eyes open, the darkness pressing against them as gently as a closed palm, and you did not sleep because sleep had not yet arrived, because the transition from wakefulness was a slow river that you drifted upon without urgency, waiting for the current to carry you to its far shore. Around you, in the enclosed space of the tent, the other soldiers breathed in rhythms that had become as familiar to you as the rhythm of the rain had been. Vargas, the loudest sleeper, had settled into a pattern of long, slow inhalations that caught slightly at the top, a faint rasp in his throat that never quite became a snore, followed by exhalations that fluttered his lips with a soft, papery sound. The man to your right, a young recruit named Herrera who had joined the company at the spring muster and still woke at every unexpected noise, breathed more quietly, his respiration shallow and even, the breath of someone who slept lightly and dreamed of nothing. The third man, whose name you rarely remembered because he rarely spoke, lay curled on his side with his blanket pulled over his head, a dark, shapeless mound from which emerged a faint whistling, a single high note that wavered slightly on the exhale and then steadied again. Together these three rhythms formed the quiet music, a lullaby of breath and rustle that filled the tent and made the silence feel inhabited rather than empty. You listened to this music without effort, letting it wash over you as you had let the rain wash over you during the watch, and your mind drifted without anchor through the dark waters of half-sleep. The ceiling of the tent was a pale grey expanse above you, its colour discernible only because the lantern outside still burned and cast a diffuse glow through the wet canvas, turning the entire interior into a chamber of soft shadow. You traced the seams of the panels with your eyes, following the lines where the canvas had been stitched together with coarse, tart thread, and you noted the small dark spot where a leak had formed earlier in the week and had been patched with a square of older, darker cloth, the patch now holding firm against the diminished rain. The center pole rose from the ground like the trunk of a slender tree, its surface dark with moisture and rough with the grain of unsmoothed wood, and from a hook near its top hung a breastplate that caught the faint light and transformed it into a dull, pewter gleam, a glimmer that shifted slightly when a current of air moved through the tent, though the air was so still now that the breastplate hung motionless, a silent sentinel of metal and leather. Beside the breastplate, a knapsack of dark canvas rested against the base of the pole, its shape lumpy and indeterminate, bulging with the spare shirt and the folding knife and the small bundle of letters that you carried with you but rarely read. The knapsack had been with you since Toledo, its strap worn smooth by the friction of your shoulder, its fabric faded from black to a brownish grey by sun and rain and the passage of many months, and as you looked at it now, it seemed less an object than a companion, a silent witness to all the watches you had stood and all the rains you had endured. Next to the knapsack, placed neatly side by side with the heels aligned as if for inspection, stood your boots, their leather darkened by water and creased across the toe in a pattern that resembled the lines on a weathered hand. The boots had been new when you left Spain, stiff and bright and smelling of the tanner's shop, but now they were soft and pliable and carried within their folds the dust of a dozen roads and the mud of 100 fields, and looking at them in the dim light you felt a mild affection for them, the affection one feels for a tool that has served well and asked nothing in return. Your gaze moved from the boots to the other objects that populated the small space. A tin plate that leaned against a tent stake, its surface scratched from many meals and still bearing the faint, greasy residue of the evening stew. A water flask of cured leather that hung from a peg, its stopper missing and replaced with a twist of rag. A small wooden crucifix that someone, perhaps Herrera, had wedged into a gap in the frame, its carved figure worn smooth by the touch of anxious fingers. A call of trites, that light and nor get hider. Each object was ordinary and unremarkable, yet in the stillness of the midnight hour they seemed to possess a quiet dignity, a patience that matched your own, and you inventoried them slowly, not with the purpose of cataloguing, but with the dreamlike attention that comes when sleep is near and the boundaries between thought and perception begin to soften. A rustle of straw drew your attention to the far corner of the tent, where the man who rarely spoke had shifted in his sleep, his blanket sliding from his shoulder to expose the pale oval of his face, his mouth slightly open, his eyelids twitching with the small movements of a dream. The rustle was a crisp, dry sound, the stalks of straw rubbing against one another with a papery whisper, and it lasted only a moment before the man settled again, his breathing resuming its faint whistling note. You watched the rise and fall of his chest, a gentle undulation that seemed to keep time with some inner metronome, and you thought about the dreams he might be dreaming, though the thought was an idle one, lacking the energy of true curiosity, simply a stone skipped across the surface of your mind before sinking into the depths. The cold that had receded when you first lay down was now returning, seeping upward from the ground through the layers of straw and blanket, its progress slow and methodical, a patient invader that asked no permission and offered no terms. You felt it first in your feet, a numbness that crept from your toes into the arches and then into the heels, and then in your hands, which you had folded across your chest and which now seemed to belong to someone else, distant appendages that responded to your commands with a slight delay. The cold spread from your extremities inward, reaching your knees and elbows, and then your hips and shoulders, and you accepted its advance with the same passive equanimity with which you had accepted the rain, knowing that resistance was futile, and that the cold, like the rain, would eventually pass, though not for many hours yet. You drew the blanket more tightly around your shoulders, and the wool scratched against your chin with a familiar, comforting roughness, its fibers stiff with old lanolin and the accumulated dust of many camps. Your mind, adrift on the slow current of the night, turned without conscious direction to a memory that had been waiting in the wings of your awareness, a memory so distant it seemed to belong to another life, another version of yourself who had existed before the rain and the mud and the long watches. You saw an olive grove in Extremadura, the trees ancient and gnarled, their silver-green leaves shimmering in the heat of a July afternoon, and you remembered the way the dry earth smelled under a hot sun, a smell of dust and thyme and the faint, sweet decay of fallen olives that had baked for days on the hard ground. The memory was so vivid that for a moment you could almost feel the heat on your skin, the weight of the sun pressing down on your shoulders, and the sensation was so different from the cold and the damp of the tent that it seemed like a story told by someone else, a tale you had heard long ago and only half remembered. You saw the twisted trunks of the olive trees, their bark rough and silvery, and the way the shade beneath them was dappled with small circles of light shifted with the breeze, and you heard the distant, drowsy sound of cicadas, their song a single sustained note that vibrated in the air like the heat itself. A woman, your sister perhaps, or your mother, you could not quite see her face, was spreading a cloth on the ground beneath the largest tree, and there was bread and cheese and a clay jug of water that had been cooled in the well, its surface beaded with condensation. The memory held no narrative, no sequence of events, simply a tableau, a single frozen moment of warmth and light and stillness, and you examined it with a gentle, detached attention, turning it over in your mind the way you might turn over a smooth stone found on a beach. After a while, the memory began to fade, the colors bleaching out of it, the sounds growing distant, and you let it go without regret, watching it recede into the darkness from which it had come. In its place came no new image, only the quiet awareness of the tent around you, the breathing of your companions, the faint gleam of the breastplate, the patient stillness of your boots. The cold had now reached your chest, a dull, spreading chill that made each breath feel slightly sharper, the air cooler in your nostrils and cooler still in your throat, and you adjusted your position on the pallet, turning onto your side and drawing your knees up toward your chest so that your body formed a compact, heat-conserving shape. The straw rustled beneath you, a crisp, dry sound that seemed loud in the midnight silence, and then the sound faded and the quiet returned, deeper than before. You could not have said how much time passed after that, because time in the midnight hour was a substance that flowed without markers, a river without banks, and you drifted upon it without attempting to measure its passage. The lantern outside the tent continued to burn, its light filtering through the canvas in a soft, diffuse glow that never brightened or dimmed, and the air remained still, the drizzle outside so fine that it seemed to hang in the air rather than fall, a suspended mist that coated everything with a layer of cold moisture. The man who rarely spoke shifted again, and his whistling breath paused for a moment, suspended, and then resumed, the high note returning with a slight quaver that smoothed itself out after a few breaths. Herrera murmured something in his sleep, a single word that you could not catch, and then he sighed, a long, soft exhalation that seemed to carry with it all the weariness of the day, and he was still again. You closed your eyes, not because you expected to sleep, but because the darkness behind your eyelids was a different kind of darkness, a softer, more personal darkness that belonged only to you. The sounds of the tent became more distinct with your eyes closed, the breathing, the rustling, the distant, almost inaudible drip of water from the center pole where a single drop had formed and was preparing to fall. You listened to that drop with a strange, focused attention, tracking its slow growth by the subtle changes in the sound of its gathering, and when it finally released itself and fell to the straw with a tiny wet sound, you felt a small, quiet satisfaction, as though you had witnessed the completion of a task that had been hours in the doing. The drop was replaced almost immediately by another, the water seeping down the pole from the saturated canvas above, and the process began again, the slow accumulation, the patient waiting, the quiet release. Your thoughts circled back to the olive grove, not as a vivid memory this time, but as a faint after-image, the ghost of a warmth that had once existed. You thought about the dust of that summer road, the fine pale dust that rose in clouds behind a cart and settled on the leaves of the olive trees, giving them a grey, powdery coating that washed away with the first autumn rain. You thought about the taste of the water from the well, how it was cold and clean and slightly mineral, a taste that seemed to come from the deep heart of the earth, and how it left a faint, pleasant dryness on the tongue. And you thought about the silence of that grove, a silence so different from the silence of the tent, a silence made of heat and light and the distant song of insects, a silence that was not the absence of sound, but the presence of a great, all-encompassing peace. These thoughts moved through your mind with the slow, meandering pace of a stream in a flat country, and you followed them without attachment, allowing them to lead you where they would. The cold continued its slow, patient work, spreading now into your back and shoulders, and you felt your muscles tighten in response. A slight tension that was not quite shivering, but rather the body's quiet preparation for a shiver that might or might not come. You pulled the blanket higher, covering your ears so that only your face was exposed, and the wool muffled the sounds of the tent, reducing them to a soft, distant murmur. The smell of the blanket filled your nostrils, a smell of wool and straw, and the faint, musty odor of long storage, and it was a smell that you associated with sleep, with the end of watches and the beginning of rest, and so you breathed it in deeply, letting it fill your lungs and calm your mind. Vargas snored once, a single loud snore that startled him half awake, and he muttered something unintelligible and turned over, the straw crackling beneath him like a small fire. The snore had broken the stillness for a moment, a sharp intrusion that quickly faded. And as the quiet returned, it seemed even deeper than before, as though the noise had carved a hollow in the silence and then left it to fill with an even greater stillness. You listened to the silence, and the silence listened back, and the two of you kept each other company through the long, slow minutes of the midnight hour. The breastplate on the center pole caught a shift in the lantern light, a brief brightening that came when the flame flared for a moment, and then the gleam faded, returning to its dull, steady glow. You watched the metal with half-closed eyes, seeing how the curve of the breastplate distorted the reflection of the tent, turning the canvas walls into a warped, dreamlike landscape of shadow and light. The metal was cold to the touch, you knew, cold and hard and unyielding, and yet from where you lay it seemed almost soft, its surface a pool of liquid grey that might ripple if you reached out to touch it. You did not reach out, because your arms were wrapped inside the blanket and moving them seemed an impossible labor, but you held the image in your mind, the gleaming breastplate and the sleeping men and the dark, patient shape of your boots, and you felt a quiet sense of belonging, a sense that you were exactly where you were supposed to be, doing exactly what you were supposed to do, and that was enough. The night wore on, and the rain remained a fine, silent mist, and the cold crept deeper into your bones, and still you did not sleep, that the boundary between waking and sleeping had grown so thin that you could no longer be certain which side of it you occupied. The olive grove returned once more, fainter now, its colors washed out to pale sepia, and the cicada's song had become a low, humming sound that you eventually recognized as the breathing of your companions, and the woman with the cloth was gone, and there was only the tree, the ancient olive tree with its silver leaves and its twisted trunk, standing alone in a field of memory that stretched away to a horizon you could not see. The hour when the sky began to separate from the land arrived without announcement, a gradual thinning of the darkness that was more a feeling than a visible change. You had not slept, or perhaps you had slept in brief shallow intervals that left no trace in your memory, and when you opened your eyes again, the canvas above you was no longer the uniform black it had been, but a deep charcoal grey, its texture just barely visible, the seams and patches emerging from the gloom like objects rising through murky water. The rain had stopped entirely at some point during the small hours, a cessation so gradual that you had not noticed it happening, the drops simply becoming fewer and farther between until there were none at all, leaving behind a silence that was different from the silence of the rain, emptier and more expectant, a held breath waiting to be released. You lay still for a long moment, listening to this new quiet, and then you pushed the blanket aside and sat up, the straw rustling beneath you with a sound that seemed unnaturally loud in the muffled air. The cold struck you immediately, a damp, penetrating chill that wrapped around your shoulders and chest the moment the blanket fell away. Your breath formed clouds of vapor that hung in the air before your face, pale ghosts that rose and dissipated and were replaced by new ones, and you watched them for a moment, noting how they moved with the faint currents of air that seeped through the gaps in the canvas. The other soldiers were still asleep, their breathing unchanged, their forms dark and motionless beneath their blankets, and you moved carefully as you reached for your boots, your fingers clumsy with cold, the leather stiff and unyielding from hours of slow drying. Pulling the boots on was a struggle that required you to brace one hand against the center pole while you worked your heel into the damp interior, and the effort sent small jolts of sensation through your cold-numbed feet, a tingling that was not quite pain, not quite pleasure, simply the return of feeling to flesh that had forgotten it. You laced the boots with slow, deliberate movements, the wet leather cords slipping through your fingers twice before you managed to tie a secure knot. And then you reached for your cloak, which had dried only slightly during the night and still hung heavy with absorbed water. The wool was cold and rough against your neck as you fastened it, and the familiar weight settled onto your shoulders like the hand of an old companion. Your Morian helmet, which you had placed on the ground beside your pallet, was beaded with condensation on its inner surface, and you wiped it with the edge of your sleeve before putting it on, the metal cold against your scalp even through the padded lining of your arming cap. The arquebus leaned against the tent pole where you had left it, and you lifted it carefully, checking by touch that the match cord was still dry and the pan cover was closed, the ritual of readiness so ingrained that you performed it without conscious thought. You stepped out through the tent flap and into a world that had been utterly transformed. The rain was gone, but in its place had come a dense white mist that rose from the saturated ground and hung in the air like a held exhalation. The mist was so thick that you could see no more than 20 paces in any direction. The familiar landmarks of the camp reduced to vague, dark shapes that seemed to float in the whiteness, unmoored from the solid earth. The lantern on its post still burned, but its light could not penetrate the fog, merely creating a pale, diffuse glow that surrounded the flame like a halo, a small sphere of yellow brightness in a universe of grey. You stood at the entrance to the tent and let the mist settle on your face, a cold, gentle touch that left a fine film of moisture on your skin, and you breathed in deeply, the air tasting of wet earth and wet canvas and the faint, clean bitterness of the fog itself. The ground underfoot had changed during the night, the mud no longer liquid and flowing, but thick and viscous, a substance that grabbed at your boots with each step and released them with a reluctant, sucking sound. You began the short walk to the perimeter, moving slowly through the mist, and the camp revealed itself to you in fragments, pieces of the familiar world emerging from the whiteness and then fading back into it as you passed. The corner of a tent appeared first, dark canvas beaded with droplets, and then the vague outline of a supply wagon, its tongue resting on the ground and its wheels sunk deep into the mud. A barrel loomed up suddenly to your left, so close you could have touched it, its wooden staves dark with water and its iron hoops glistening with a thin layer of rust. The world was a series of islands in the fog, each object isolated and complete in itself, lacking the connections that normally bound them into the coherent whole of the camp. And you navigated between them by memory and by the subtle cues of the ground beneath your feet. The mist muffled every sound, absorbing the high notes and leaving only the low, the soft thud of your footsteps in the mud, the distant murmur of a voice that might have been a sentry calling to his relief, or might have been nothing at all, a trick of the fog and the silence. The air was so still that the mist seemed almost solid, a substance you could part with your hands, and as you walked through it, you left a swirling wake behind you, the vapor disturbed by your passage, and then slowly settling back into place. The cold was a constant presence, not the sharp, biting cold of winter, but a deeper, wetter cold that seeped into your joints and made your movements slightly stiff, slightly deliberate, as though you were walking through water. You reached the perimeter and found Alonso still at his post, his figure emerging from the mist by degrees. First the dark shape of his cloak, then the outline of his helmet, then the pale oval of his face, his features indistinct and blurred by the fog. He turned his head as you approached, a slow, ponderous movement that seemed to take a great deal of effort, and he nodded once, a small inclination of the chin that was both greeting and acknowledgement. You took up your position a few paces to his left, facing the field that was now entirely invisible, a vast blankness that stretched away into the fog and might have contained anything or nothing. The lantern on your post had gone out at some point during the night, its flame extinguished by the damp or by the exhaustion of its oil, and the post stood bare and dark, a wooden sentinel keeping watch over an empty circle of mud. The mist shifted slowly, currents of air so subtle you could barely feel them moving the vapor in great, lazy swirls, and as you watched, a shape began to emerge from the whiteness ahead of you. It was a low, dark form that resolved itself gradually into the wheel of a cannon, the iron-rimmed wooden disc half sunk in the mud and glistening with moisture. The cannon itself was invisible, its barrel lost in the fog, but the wheel was there, a single detail of a larger object that the mist had chosen to reveal, and you studied it with the detached attention that comes from having nothing else to study, noting the way the iron tire was pitted with rust, the way the spokes radiated from the hub like the rays of a frozen sun, the way a single droplet of water hung from the lowest point of the rim and caught the faint grey light from the sky. The droplet hung there for a long time, trembling slightly with some vibration too small to feel, and then it fell, and the wheel was just a wheel again, a dark shape in the mist. Another shape appeared to the right of the cannon wheel, taller and thinner, and you watched it slowly become the lower half of a flagpole, its base set in a cairn of stones that had been gathered from the field, its wood dark and straight and disappearing upward into the fog. The flag, if there was a flag, was hidden in the whiteness above, but you knew it was there, a square of faded red and gold that hung limp and wet in the still air, its folds heavy with absorbed moisture. The flagpole had been erected on the first day the camp was established, driven into the ground with much shouting and the rhythmic pounding of mallets, and it had stood there ever since, a marker of territory and a symbol of presence, though in the fog it seemed less a symbol than a lonely vertical line, a stroke of darkness against the grey. The mist thickened for a moment, swallowing the wheel and the flagpole and leaving only the blankness, and then it thinned again, and a new shape came into view, larger and more solid than the others. It was the hunchback of a sleeping ox, the animal lying on its side in the mud with its legs tucked beneath it, its hide dark with water and its great head resting on the ground. The ox was one of the draft animals that pulled the supply wagons, a massive, patient creature with a yoke-worn neck and a slow, gentle gaze, and as you watched, its sides rose and fell with a deep, slow breath, the movement so gradual it was almost imperceptible. A thin curl of steam rose from its nostrils, a wisp of warmth that mingled with the mist, and was absorbed into it, and the ox slept on, undisturbed by the cold, or the damp, or the strange, shrouded world that had grown up around it during the night. You felt a quiet kinship with the animal, another creature that endured and waited, and asked for nothing more than hay and water and the occasional warmth of the sun. And you watched its breathing for a while, letting the slow rhythm settle into your own body, until your breath and the ox's breath seemed to move in time. A sound cut through the stillness, a raw, harsh call that hung in the air and then dissolved, leaving a ringing silence behind it. It was a rook, somewhere in the greyness, its voice the only bird call that seemed suited to this wet and misty country, a sound that was neither musical nor comforting, but simply present, a fact of the world like the mud and the cold. The rook called again, farther away this time, and then a third time, so distant it was barely audible, and then it was silent, and the mist closed over the space where the sound had been. You listened for a response from another bird, but none came, and you understood that the rook was alone, a solitary sentinel in the fog, just as you were a solitary sentinel at the edge of the camp. The light continued to increase, though so slowly that you could not mark its progress, the grey of the sky lightening by almost imperceptible degrees, from charcoal to pewter to a pale luminous silver that seemed to glow from within the mist itself. The fog was still thick, but it was a different kind of thickness now, less opaque, shot through with a diffuse brightness that made the shapes within it seem softer and less distinct. You could see further than before, though not much further, perhaps 30 paces now, and the world had expanded from a circle of 20 paces to a circle of 30, a small victory that you noted without celebration. The mud at your feet was becoming visible in greater detail, the ridges and furrows left by yesterday's traffic emerging from the gloom, the puddles gleaming with a pale milky light that reflected the brightening sky. You stamped your feet occasionally, a habit that had become so automatic you no longer thought about it, the motion sending small shocks of warmth through your legs and chasing away the stiffness that gathered in your ankles and knees when you stood still for too long. The stamping made a wet, heavy sound in the mud, a sound that the mist absorbed and softened and returned to you as a dull thud, and each time you stamped, you felt the ground give slightly beneath you, the water-logged earth compressing and then slowly springing back. The cold continued its patient work, but the faint lightening of the sky brought with it the promise of warmth, a promise that you knew would not be fulfilled for hours yet, but that was nevertheless a comfort, a small hope to carry through the remaining time of the watch. A new sound reached you, a faint, rhythmic creaking that you recognized after a moment as the tent ropes tightening and loosening as the canvas absorbed the morning damp and shifted on its poles. The sound was almost musical, a low, groaning note that rose and fell with the subtle movements of the fabric, and it came from all around you. From every tent in the camp, a chorus of small adjustments that marked the slow waking of the world. The ropes had been soaked through, their hemp fibers swollen with water, and as they dried in the morning air, they would contract, pulling the canvas taut and raising the roof lines by fractions of an inch. You had witnessed this process countless times on countless mornings, and you understood it as one of the small, reliable mechanisms of camp life, a thing as predictable as the sunrise, though the sunrise itself was still hidden behind the mist. The ox shifted in its sleep, its legs twitching with some dream of green pastures, and a low, rumbling sound came from its throat, a sound that was not quite a moo, not quite a sigh, simply the noise of a large animal turning over in its rest. The steam from its nostrils had thickened, a small column of warmth that rose straight up in the still air and then bent and dissipated as it met the colder mist above. You watched the steam for a while, seeing how it swirled and eddied in currents too small to feel, and you thought about the warmth of the ox's body beneath its thick hide, the slow, steady furnace of its digestion turning hay and grass into heat, a heat that radiated outward into the cold air and was swallowed by the fog. The ox was a warm thing in a cold world, and you took a small, irrational comfort from its presence, the way you might take comfort from a banked fire or a cup of hot broth. The mist began to lift very slightly, its lower edges rising from the ground to reveal the mud and the grass and the small sodden plants that grew in the churned earth between the tents. The change was so gradual that you could not say when it started, only that at some point you noticed that you could see the base of the flagpole where before you had seen only the upper half, and that the cannon wheel was now visible in its entirety, its lower rim sunk in the mud and its spokes disappearing into the hub that was still wreathed in vapor. The world was emerging from the fog by slow inches, revealing itself layer by layer, and you watched the process with the patient attention of a man who had nowhere else to be and nothing else to do, simply present, simply watching, simply waiting for the day to begin. The camp woke slowly, not with the blare of trumpets or the urgent shouting of sergeants, but with the gradual accumulation of small sounds and small movements that spread from tent to tent like the ripples from a stone dropped into still water. The mist was still lifting when the first signs of morning life began, the pale grey light now strong enough to cast faint shadows on the mud, and you stood at the perimeter, watching the camp come awake with the same patient attention you had given to the darkness hours before. A cook emerged from the tent nearest the fire pit, his figure hunched against the cold, his breath pluming in the damp air, and he made his way with slow, deliberate steps to the pile of split wood that had been covered with a tarpaulin against the night's rain. The tarpaulin came away with a wet, heavy sound, and the cook bent to gather an armload of sticks, his movements economical and unhurried, the movements of a man who had performed this task on so many mornings that it required no thought. Other figures began to appear between the rows of tents, men wrapped in their cloaks against the damp, their helmets left behind in favor of soft wool caps that covered their ears. They moved toward the fire pit in ones and twos, their boots squelching in the mud, and their voices were low and rough with sleep, the first words of the day spoken in murmurs that the mist swallowed before they could carry far. You heard a fragment of conversation, a man asking about the condition of the road to the supply depot, and another man answering that the road was a river of mud, impassable for wagons, and then the voices faded as the speakers moved away, their words replaced by the quiet sounds of the fire being laid and coaxed into life. The cook crouched over the arranged sticks, striking a flint against a steel with quick, practiced motions, and soon a thin thread of smoke began to rise from the kindling, pale and hesitant at first, then thicker, then brightening with the first small tongue of flame. The fire caught with a soft, crackling sound, and the cook fed it larger sticks, building the flame with a patience that matched your own. The smoke from the fire rose in a column that climbed a short distance into the air and then flattened under the low clouds, spreading into a horizontal layer that drifted across the camp and mingled with the remnants of the mist. The smell of burning wood reached you, a clean, sharp scent that cut through the dampness and promised warmth and food and the small comforts of the morning. Other fires were being lit now, a second near the officers' tents and a third near the picket line where a soldier was heating water for the horses, and their smoke joined the first fire's smoke, pale columns rising and flattening and merging into a single thin haze that hung over the camp like a blessing. You watched the smoke and listened to the sounds of the waking camp, and you felt the weight of the long night beginning to lift, the alertness that had sustained you through the dark hours giving way to a quieter, more settled awareness. The relief arrived without ceremony, another soldier whose name you knew but whose face was still blurred by the grey morning light, and he nodded to you as Alonso had nodded to you hours before. The same nod, the same silent transfer of responsibility. You returned the nod and stepped away from the perimeter. Your duty complete, the torch of watchfulness passed once again. The walk back toward the center of the camp was a familiar journey, your boots finding the same ruts and puddles they had found during the night, though now the ruts were visible and the puddles were pale mirrors of the sky, their surfaces stirred by the faint drizzle that had begun to fall again, a rain so soft and fine it seemed less like rain than like the air itself condensing on every surface. You passed the cannon, its barrel now visible as a dark cylinder of iron beaded with moisture, and the flagpole where the flag hung limp and dark, and the sleeping ox, who had woken and was now standing on its 4 great legs, its head lowered and its eyes half closed, a picture of patient endurance. The queue for the morning meal had already formed by the time you reached the cook's fire, a line of perhaps 10 men standing with wooden bowls in their hands, their breath forming small clouds that rose and vanished. You took your place at the end of the line, and the man ahead of you, a soldier with a thin face and a day's growth of beard, turned to look at you, and then turned back without speaking, the silence not unfriendly, but simply empty of anything that needed to be said. The line moved forward in small increments, each step a few inches through the mud, and you shuffled along with the others, your bowl held against your chest, your eyes fixed on the back of the man ahead of you, on the way his cloak was frayed at the hem, on the dark line of moisture that had wickered up from the ground to stain the wool. The cook was ladling the gruel from a large iron pot that hung over the fire on a tripod, and the steam from the pot rose in a thick, fragrant column that smelled of boiled oats and water and nothing else. A smell so plain and unadorned it was almost a comfort. When your turn came, you held out your bowl, a wooden vessel that had been carved from a single piece of beech and was darkened with age and use, its rim chipped in 2 places, its interior worn smooth by the passage of countless spoons. The cook dipped his ladle into the pot and filled your bowl with a greyish, steaming substance that was the colour of the sky overhead and had the consistency of thick paste. A single drop of the gruel spilled over the rim of the bowl and ran down the outside, and you wiped it with your thumb and then licked your thumb clean, the taste faint and bland, the barest hint of salt, and the earthy flavour of boiled grain. The cook looked at you, his face reddened by the heat of the fire, and he said something about the rain starting again, a comment so obvious it required no answer, and you nodded and moved away from the fire carrying your bowl carefully with both hands, the warmth of the gruel seeping through the wood and into your cold fingers. You found a place to sit on an upturned crate that had been positioned near the armourer's tent, its wooden surface dark with moisture, but still solid enough to bear your weight. The crate had once held cannonballs, you knew, because the stenciled letters on its side, now faded to illegibility, spelled out the name of a foundry in Seville, and the wood smelled faintly of iron and the distant memory of gunpowder. You sat down with your back against the canvas of the tent, the fabric cool and damp through your cloak, and you began to eat, spooning the gruel into your mouth with a tin spoon that had been bent slightly in the middle, so that it sat at a crooked angle in your hand. The gruel was exactly as it always was, warm and thick, and almost entirely without flavour, the salt barely detectable, the oats cooked down to a soft, uniform mush that required little chewing and left a faint, pleasant coating on your tongue. Each spoonful was the same as the one before. The same temperature, the same texture, the same bland, comforting taste. And you ate slowly, without hurry, letting the warmth spread from your stomach outward through your body. Around you, the camp had settled into the quiet rhythm of the morning. Men sat on crates and on folded blankets, and on the damp ground, eating their gruel and speaking in low tones about the small matters that filled a soldier's day. You heard a conversation about the supply of match cord, whether there was enough to last another week, and another about the condition of a mule that had developed a limp, and a third about the mud on the road to the east that had swallowed a cartwheel the previous afternoon. The words were spoken without urgency, without excitement, the practical language of men who had grown accustomed to discomfort and uncertainty and had ceased to be troubled by either. You listened without joining in, your attention moving from one conversation to another, and then back to your bowl, where the level of gruel was slowly lowering, the grey surface receding with each spoonful. The rain had strengthened from a mist to a soft, steady drizzle that pattered on the canvas above you, and on the mud at your feet, and on the brim of your helmet, which you had removed and placed on the ground beside the crate. The drizzle was not heavy enough to disturb any activity, not heavy enough to send men running for shelter, but it was present, a constant, gentle presence that added a fresh layer of moisture to everything already wet, beading on the shoulders of cloaks and dripping from the edges of tents and collecting in the small hollows of the ground. You turned your face up to it for a moment, feeling the cool droplets touch your forehead and cheeks, and then you looked down again, returning your attention to the bowl and the spoon and the slow, methodical process of eating. A soldier was sitting on a crate a few paces to your left, a man whose name you thought might be Ruiz, but whom you had never spoken to beyond the exchange of brief, practical words. He was bent over a doublet spread across his knees, a needle in one hand and the length of dark thread in the other, and he was repairing a torn seam with the patient concentration of someone who had done this work many times before. The needle moved in and out of the fabric with a steady, rhythmic motion, the thread pulling through with a soft, whispering sound that was just audible beneath the patter of the rain. The soldier's hands were large and roughened, the knuckles scarred and the nails broken, but they moved with a delicacy that seemed almost at odds with their appearance, guiding the needle through the wool with the precision of long practice. You watched him work, seeing how he held the fabric taut with his left hand, how he paused occasionally to examine the line of stitches he had made, how he reached into a small pouch at his belt to retrieve a fresh length of thread when the old one ran out. The torn seam was a long one, running from the shoulder to the elbow, and the soldier had already closed half of it, the new stitches, small and even and nearly invisible against the dark fabric. The work was slow, methodical, and utterly absorbing, and you watched it without thinking, your spoon pausing halfway to your mouth, your attention held by the quiet, repetitive motion of the needle. The soldier looked up once, meeting your gaze, and you nodded slightly, a gesture that acknowledged the shared moment without requiring anything further. He nodded back, a small inclination of the head, and then returned his attention to the doublet, and you returned your attention to your bowl, and the small exchange was over, complete in itself, needing no elaboration. The rain continued to fall, and the camp continued its slow, orderly waking, and you finished the last of the gruel, scraping the bowl with the bent spoon to collect the final, thin layer of oats, the metal scraping against the wood with a soft, hollow sound. When the bowl was empty, you set it aside on the ground, where the drizzle immediately began to rinse it clean, the water collecting in the bottom and then overflowing, carrying tiny fragments of oat away with it. You remained seated on the crate, your hands resting on your knees, your body still and quiet, and you let the morning wash over you, the sounds and the smells and the gentle, persistent rain. The cook's fire had been reduced to a bed of glowing embers, the flames no longer visible, and the smoke had thinned to a pale wisp that barely rose above the pot. The horses in the picket line had been fed, and you could hear the rhythmic grinding of their teeth as they chewed their hay, a sound that was deep and steady and somehow reassuring. The ox had been harnessed to a wagon and was standing patiently, while the driver adjusted the traces, its great head swaying slowly from side to side as it waited. The flag on the flagpole had begun to stir in a breeze so faint you could barely feel it on your skin, its folds lifting and falling with a soft, wet sound. All these small details arranged themselves around you like the pieces of a familiar painting, and you took them in without urgency, letting them settle into your awareness and then letting them go, making room for the next moment and the moment after that. A voice called out from somewhere near the officers' tents, a low, unhurried call announcing the morning muster in half an hour, and the men around you began to stir, rising from their crates and blankets, collecting their bowls and their gear, moving toward their tents to prepare for the day. You rose as well, your legs stiff from sitting, your cloak heavy with moisture, and you picked up your bowl and your helmet and your arquebus, cradling them against your chest. The soldier with the doublet had finished his repair and was now folding the garment carefully, smoothing the fabric with his palm, his needle and thread already stowed away in his pouch. He stood and stretched, his arms reaching toward the grey sky, and then he walked away into the drizzle, his figure growing smaller and softer until it was swallowed by the mist and the rain. You watched him go, and then you turned toward your own tent, the mud sucking at your boots with each step, the drizzle falling with the same patient, unending rhythm it had maintained since the day before, and the morning, quiet and uneventful and entirely without drama, continued its slow, steady passage toward the afternoon. The afternoon watch was still several hours away, a distant obligation that sat quietly at the back of your mind, not yet demanding attention. The morning meal had settled into a dull warmth in your stomach, and the camp had returned to the slow, methodical rhythms of daytime, men moving between tents with the unhurried pace of those who had no immediate task but knew that tasks would find them soon enough. The rain had resumed its patient work, a soft, steady drizzle that fell straight down through the windless air, and the canvas of the tents glistened with a fresh layer of moisture that reflected the pale grey light of the overcast sky. You made your way toward a long, low awning that had been erected near the armorer's tent, a shelter of oiled canvas stretched over a framework of poles beneath which soldiers could sit and tend their equipment without exposing themselves fully to the weather. The ground beneath the awning had been trampled into a hard, dark floor by the passage of many boots, and it was scattered with scraps of leather and twists of wire and the fine metallic dust that accumulated wherever weapons were sharpened and repaired. You found a space at the end of a rough wooden bench, the wood dark with moisture and worn smooth by long use, and you sat down with a quiet grunt, the weight of your body settling onto the hard surface. The bench was just low enough that your knees rose slightly above your hips, a position that you had learned to tolerate because it allowed you to rest your arquebus across your thighs without straining your shoulders. The awning above you drummed with the sound of the rain, a steady, muffled rhythm that was quieter than the sound of rain on the tents but still present, a constant backdrop to the small, precise work you were about to perform. Water dripped from the edge of the awning in a long, irregular line, each drop falling to the mud with a soft, repetitive sound, and the air beneath the canvas was cool and still and smelled of oil and damp wool and the faint, sharp tang of metal. You began by laying out the items you would need, arranging them on the bench beside you with the careful deliberation of long habit. A length of new match cord, still coiled in a neat circle, its fibers pale and dry and smelling faintly of saltpeter. A small clay pot of linseed oil, its surface sticky with old drips, the oil inside dark and viscous, and carrying a nutty, earthy scent that you had come to associate with the quiet hours of equipment maintenance. A square of clean linen cloth, slightly frayed at the edges, folded into a precise rectangle that fit neatly in the palm of your hand. A second cloth, older and more stained, for wiping away the black residue of burnt powder. A small brass wire pick, its tip bent into a tiny hook, for clearing the touch hole. A whetstone, dark with old oil, its surface grooved from years of sharpening, wrapped in a piece of soft leather. And a small pouch of lead balls, each one a perfect sphere, cool and heavy, and dimpled with the marks of the mold. The arquebus itself lay across your thighs, its wooden stock dark and smooth, polished by the friction of your hands and the slow absorption of oil over many months. The barrel was a long cylinder of iron, its surface muffled with a fine, even coat of dark patina, and the matchlock mechanism sat atop the stock like a small, intricate creature of brass and steel. You looked at the weapon for a moment, seeing not the object as a whole, but the assembly of its parts, each one familiar and named, each one requiring a specific kind of attention. The ritual of maintenance was as familiar to you as the ritual of the watch, a sequence of actions that you had performed so many times that your hands could carry them out without conscious direction, though you never hurried, because hurrying led to mistakes and mistakes led to malfunctions and malfunctions in some distant and unlikely future that you did not bother to imagine might lead to something worse. He began with the match cord, untying the old length from the serpentine, the curved brass arm that would lower the burning tip into the priming pan when the trigger was pulled. The old cord was dark with use, its end blackened and frayed, and it released a faint, acrid smell of burnt hemp as you coiled it and set it aside. The new cord was stiff and pale, and you measured it against the length of your arm, a habit that needed no measurement because you knew exactly how long it should be, the length that would burn for the duration of a watch without needing to be adjusted. You threaded one end through the serpentine and tightened the small brass screw that held it in place, your fingers working slowly, deliberately, the metal cold and slightly slick with old oil. The screw turned with a faint, gritty resistance, and you tightened it until it would turn no further, then backed it off a quarter turn, a tiny adjustment that you could not have explained, but that felt right. The match cord now hung from the serpentine in a gentle curve, its free end dangling almost to the stock, and you tucked the excess length into the small leather pouch that hung from the side of the weapon, where it would remain dry and ready. This done, you lifted the matchlock cover, a small hinged plate that protected the priming pan from rain and damp, and you inspected the pan itself, a shallow brass dish that was crusted with the grey-black residue of old powder. The residue had hardened during the night, forming a thin, brittle crust that cracked when you touched it with the tip of the brass pick, and you scraped it away carefully, the pick making a faint, scratching sound against the metal. The residue fell away in small, dark flakes that scattered onto the bench and stuck to the damp wood, and you wiped them away with a stained cloth, revealing the bright, clean brass beneath. The touch hole, a tiny channel that led from the priming pan into the barrel, was dark and clogged, and you inserted the hooked end of the wire pick with the delicacy of a man threading a needle. The wire slid into the hole with a slight resistance, and you worked it back and forth gently, feeling the obstruction give way and crumble, the tiny grains of burnt powder falling into the barrel where they would be expelled later. You withdrew the pick and held it up to the grey light, seeing the dark smudge of residue on its tip, and you wiped it clean on the cloth before setting it aside. The touch hole was now clear, a tiny, perfect circle that led into the darkness of the barrel, and you felt a small, quiet satisfaction at the completion of this small task. The barrel itself required a different kind of attention, a slower, more patient process that could not be rushed. You took the ramrod from its channel beneath the barrel, a long, slender rod of wood that was dark with age and oil, its end fitted with a small brass tip. You wrapped a corner of the clean linen cloth around the brass tip and dipped it into the pot of linseed oil, letting the cloth absorb just enough oil to glisten without dripping, and then you inserted the ramrod into the muzzle of the barrel and began to work it slowly downward. The cloth slid into the iron tube with a soft, smooth sound, the oil coating the inner surface of the barrel in a thin, even layer, and you pushed the ramrod all the way to the breech, feeling the slight resistance of the cloth against the iron, and then you withdrew it, with the same slow, steady motion. The cloth came out darkened, carrying with it the fine black residue of old powder and the microscopic particles of lead that had accumulated from many firings, and you examined it briefly before folding it to expose a clean surface and repeating the process. You did this 3 times, each pass smoother than the last, until the cloth emerged clean and the barrel you knew was as clean as it could be made. The exterior of the barrel needed oiling as well, not to clean it, but to protect it from the damp air that would otherwise find every microscopic pore in the iron and begin the slow, patient work of rust. You dipped a fresh corner of the cloth into the oil and ran it along the length of the barrel, the metal darkening and gleaming under the cloth's passage, the oil filling the air with its nutty scent. The barrel absorbed the oil in a way that seemed almost thirsty, the dark patina drinking it in and becoming richer and deeper in color, and you worked slowly from breech to muzzle, turning the cloth to reach the underside and the areas around the sights where moisture liked to gather. The sights themselves, a simple front post and a rear notch, were clean and true, and you wiped them carefully, ensuring that no oil would obscure their edges should the weapon ever need to be aimed, which it would not today, not on this quiet, rain-soaked afternoon. The matchlock mechanism required its own portion of oil, the small, precise application of the cloth to the moving parts, the hinge of the serpentine, the spring of the trigger, the pivot of the pan cover. You worked the oil into each joint with the tip of your finger, feeling the metal move smoothly under your touch, the tiny mechanical clicks and slides that were the language of the lock. The serpentine moved through its arc with a quiet oiled precision, and the pan cover snapped shut with a crisp, definite sound that was satisfying in its finality. The trigger, when you pulled it gently, released the serpentine with a soft, mechanical sigh, and you caught it before it struck the pan, easing it back into position and setting the mechanism to rest. The maintenance of the arquebus was now complete, a process that had consumed perhaps half an hour of the long afternoon, and you set the weapon aside, leaning it against the bench with the muzzle pointed up and the stock resting on a dry patch of ground. The rain continued to fall beyond the awning, its steady drumming unchanged, and the world beneath the canvas was quiet and still, a small pocket of industry in the general somnolence of the camp. You stretched your fingers, feeling the stiffness that had settled into the joints from the small, precise movements, and you flexed them open and closed several times, the motion sending small pops through the knuckles that were audible in the quiet air. The sword came next, a straight, double-edged blade of Toledo steel that hung in a leather scabbard from your belt. You drew it slowly, the steel whispering against the leather, and you laid it across your thighs with the blade resting on the oiled cloth, its edge gleaming dully in the grey light. The sword was a plain, functional weapon, its hilt wrapped in dark leather that had been worn smooth by your grip, its pommel a simple sphere of brass that was spotted with the greenish patina of age. The blade was clean, because you cleaned it after every use, and you had not used it in weeks, but the edge was beginning to dull, the fine, sharp line that separated the two bevels rounding slightly under the microscopic assaults of rust and time. You reached for the whetstone and the small bottle of oil that you used exclusively for sharpening, a lighter, thinner oil than the linseed, and you began the slow, meditative work of restoring the edge. The whetstone was dark with old oil, its surface grooved and worn, and you held it in your left hand while you applied a few drops of oil to its surface, the liquid spreading in a thin, glistening film. You placed the blade against the stone at the precise angle that experience had taught you, a shallow, consistent angle that would produce the sharpest edge, and you began to move the stone along the blade in long, sweeping strokes that started at the hilt and ended at the tip. The sound of the sharpening was a low, rhythmic scraping, a sound that was almost musical in its regularity, and it blended with the sound of the rain and the distant murmur of voices from elsewhere in the camp to create a quiet, industrious symphony. Each stroke removed an infinitesimal amount of steel, and you could feel the bite of the stone through the blade, a faint vibration that traveled up through the metal and into your hand, telling you that the edge was being drawn. You worked methodically, dividing the blade into sections and giving each section the same number of strokes, the same careful attention. The edge near the hilt received 20 strokes on one side, then 20 on the other, and you tested the sharpness by holding the blade up to the light and sighting along the edge, looking for the tiny glimmers of light that would indicate a dull spot. Finding none, you moved to the middle section, repeating the process, the strokes becoming almost automatic, your arm moving in a steady, unvarying rhythm, while your mind drifted in the quiet, empty space that always opened up during this kind of work. The tip of the blade required a different technique, a smaller, circular motion that followed the curve of the point, and you gave it the same number of strokes, the stone making a finer, higher sound as it worked the thinner steel. When the sharpening was done, you wiped the blade clean with a fresh corner of the cloth, removing the dark residue of oil and microscopic steel, and you held the sword up before you, turning it to catch the light. The edge was now a fine, bright line, so sharp it seemed to disappear when you looked at it straight on, and you nodded to yourself, a small private gesture of approval that no one else would see. The scabbard received its own portion of attention, a few drops of oil worked into the leather to keep it supple, and then you slid the sword home with a soft, satisfying sound, the hilt settling against the mouth of the scabbard with a quiet click. There were still small tasks to complete, the minor, unglamorous labors that filled the empty hours and kept the machinery of a soldier's life in order. You retrieved your kit from the tent, a small leather bag that contained the odds and ends that accumulated over months of service, and you sat back down on the bench to sort through it. A buckle on your shoulder strap had been working loose for days, the leather stretching and the brass ton no longer fitting snugly into its hole, and you took a small awl from the bag and punched a new hole, the tool piercing the leather with a faint, crisp sound. The strap now tightened properly, the buckle lying flat against your chest, and you tested it by pulling on the end, feeling the secure resistance that told you the repair was sound. A frayed strap on your knapsack received similar attention, the loose fibers trimmed away with a small knife and the end sealed with a dab of wax from a lump of beeswax you carried for this purpose. The wax was pale and sweet-smelling, and it softened under the warmth of your fingers, soaking into the leather and binding the fibers together. You smoothed it with your thumb, feeling the wax cool and harden, and then you set the knapsack aside, its strap now neat and whole. Finally, you counted the lead balls in your pouch, pouring them out onto the cloth in a small, heavy pile and counting them one by one, your lips moving silently with the numbers. There were 37, enough for many watches and many skirmishes, though no skirmishes were expected, and none had occurred in weeks. The balls were cool and heavy, their surfaces dimpled with the marks of the mold, and they made a soft, clicking sound as you returned them to the pouch one by one. The pouch, when full, was a satisfying weight in your hand, a weight that spoke of preparedness and patience, and the quiet readiness that was the essence of a soldier's life in this wet, green country. The afternoon had advanced by slow degrees while you worked, the grey light shifting almost imperceptibly toward the deeper grey that preceded evening, though evening was still hours away. The rain had not stopped, had not even paused, and the drip from the edge of the awning continued its steady, rhythmic fall, each drop a small, separate event that merged into the long, continuous event of the day. You gathered your tools and returned them to their places, the whetstone wrapped in its leather, the oil pot stoppered, the cloth folded into its neat rectangle, and you sat for a moment with your hands resting on your thighs, listening to the rain and the distant sounds of the camp, and the quiet, peaceful silence of a task completed. The afternoon had settled into a long, quiet lull, the kind of hour when the camp seemed to hold its breath between the morning's small labors and the evening's approaching duties. The rain continued to fall beyond the canvas awning, a steady, whispering presence that had become so familiar you no longer heard it as a separate sound, but rather as a quality of the silence itself, a gentle, pervading dampness that softened every edge and blurred every outline. You had finished the maintenance of your weapons, the arquebus now leaning clean and oiled against the tent pole, the sword resting in its scabbard with a freshly honed edge, and the small leather pouch of lead balls was a comforting weight at your belt. The bench beneath you was hard and cool, its surface worn to a dull sheen by the passage of many soldiers before you, and you sat for a while without moving, your hands resting loosely on your thighs, your mind drifting in the aimless, unhurried way that belongs to moments of stillness. After a time, a thought surfaced from the quiet pool of your awareness, a thought that had been waiting patiently at the back of your mind since the previous evening. It was a thought about your sister in Toledo, about the letter you had been meaning to write to her for weeks, a letter that existed only as a vague intention, a collection of unformed sentences that you had composed and recomposed during long watches and never committed to paper. The thought was not urgent, not the sharp prod of obligation, but the gentle nudge of affection, a reminder that there was someone in the world who would welcome a few words from you, however plain and unremarkable those words might be. You rose from the bench, your joints protesting slightly with a soft, muffled creak, and you walked through the drizzle to your tent, the mud sucking at your boots with the same patient, relentless grip it had exerted all day. Inside the tent, the air was cool and still and smelled of damp straw and old wool, the familiar, musty scent of a space inhabited by sleeping men and stored equipment. You knelt beside your knapsack, the dark canvas lumpy and soft from long use, and you loosened the drawstring with fingers that were still slightly stiff from the cold and the fine work of sharpening. From the interior of the bag, you retrieved the writing materials that you carried everywhere but rarely used: a sheet of coarse paper, a quill, and a small clay pot of ink. The paper had been folded into quarters, the creases soft and frayed from being carried against your spare shirt, and it rustled with a dry, papery sound as you drew it out and laid it on your folded blanket. The quill was a goose feather, its barbs worn and broken from previous use, its shaft yellowed with age and stained at the tip with the dark ghost of old ink. The inkpot was a small, unglazed clay vessel with a cork stopper, its surface rough and cool to the touch, its weight reassuring in your palm, the weight of a thing that was small but substantial, a container of possibilities. You gathered these items and carried them back to the awning, cradling them against your chest with the same careful attention you gave to your arquebus, and you settled yourself on the bench once more, this time with your back against a damp wooden crate that served as a makeshift backrest. The crate was one of the supply boxes that had been unloaded from a wagon weeks earlier, its slats dark with moisture and its iron bands rusted to a deep, flaking orange, and it creaked slightly when you leaned against it, a low, woody sound that was swallowed by the rain. You arranged the writing materials on the bench beside you, the paper on the left, the quill on the right, the ink pot in the middle, and you looked at them for a moment, this small, silent assembly of objects that held within them the potential for connection, for words traveling across wet fields and muddy roads and sun-baked plains, all the way to the stone house in Toledo, where your sister would open the letter and read it by the light of a window. The first task was the smoothing of the paper, a ritual that you performed with the same methodical care you brought to cleaning your arquebus. The sheet had been folded for so long that it was reluctant to lie flat, its corners curling upward and its center rising in a shallow hump, and you pressed it gently against the rough wood of the bench with the heel of your hand, working outward from the middle to the edges with slow, sweeping motions. The paper was coarse and thick, its surface flecked with tiny fibers and the occasional dark speck of the rag from which it had been made, and it made a soft, scraping sound as you smoothed it, a sound that was almost inaudible beneath the rain but present, a small, dry whisper. The creases resisted your efforts, the deep, permanent folds that would never fully disappear no matter how many times you pressed them, and you accepted this, as you accepted the mud and the cold and the steady, unending rain, because some things were simply the way they were and required no correction. When the paper was as flat as it would ever be, you picked up the quill and examined it in the grey light. The nib was a small, sharpened point that had been cut at a precise angle, and it was clogged with a flake of old ink, a tiny dark obstruction that you removed with the edge of your thumbnail, scraping gently until the point was clean and sharp. You tested the quill against the pad of your thumb, drawing an invisible line across the skin, feeling the slight scratch of the sharpened tip and the faint tickling sensation of the barbs brushing against your hand. The quill was light and balanced, its shaft fitting comfortably into the hollow between your thumb and forefinger, a tool that was as familiar to you as the arquebus or the whetstone, though you used it far less often. The ink pot required attention next, the small clay vessel that had been sealed with a cork since the last time you had written, which was so long ago that you could not recall the date or the content of that previous letter. The cork was tight, swollen with moisture from the damp air, and you worked it loose with a gentle twisting motion, the cork squeaking faintly against the clay as it turned. When it came free, a small, sharp scent rose from the open pot, the smell of oak gall and iron, and the faint, sooty residue of lampblack, a smell that was dark and acrid and somehow serious, the smell of permanence. The ink inside was a thick, black liquid, its surface reflecting the grey sky as a tiny, dark mirror, and you saw your own face distorted in its curve, a pale, upside-down image that rippled when you breathed. A thin skin had formed on the surface of the ink, a delicate papery layer of dried pigment, and you broke it with the tip of the quill, stirring the ink gently until it was smooth and even, the quill making small wet sounds as it moved through the liquid. Now everything was ready, the paper smooth, the quill sharp, the ink stirred, and there was nothing left to do but write. You held the quill in your hand, the shaft resting against the side of your middle finger, the tip poised a fraction of an inch above the paper, and you paused. The pause was not a hesitation born of uncertainty, but rather a gathering of thought, a moment of stillness in which you considered the vast empty whiteness of the page and the infinite number of words that might fill it. The rain fell beyond the awning, the drops striking the mud and the canvas and the brim of your helmet with their soft, patient rhythm, and you listened to that rhythm for a while, letting it settle into your breathing, letting the quiet of the afternoon fill the spaces between your thoughts. You decided, eventually, to write the date, because the date was a simple thing, a fixed point in the endless flow of days, a small anchor of certainty in a world of mud and rain. You lowered the quill to the paper and began to write, the nib scratching across the coarse surface with a faint, dry sound that was like the whisper of a broom across a stone floor. The ink flowed from the nib in a thin, dark line, the letters forming under your hand with the slow, deliberate precision of long practice. You wrote the day, the month, the year, each character carefully shaped, the ink glistening wetly for a moment before soaking into the fibers of the paper and drying to a dull, permanent black. The date sat at the top of the page, a small island of text in a sea of empty space, and when it was finished, you lifted the quill and examined what you had written, seeing how the ink had pooled slightly at the end of each stroke, how the letters leaned just a little to the right, how the whole thing was a small, perfect record of a moment that had already passed. You paused again, the quill suspended above the paper, and you thought about what should come next. The greeting, perhaps, a simple salutation to your sister. Her name, the name that you had spoken 1,000 times in the house in Toledo, but had not spoken aloud in months. You could see her face in your mind, the dark hair and the dark eyes and the small, crooked smile that she wore when she was amused by something, and you could hear the sound of her voice, though the actual words of that voice were lost to memory, replaced by a general impression of warmth. You thought about the things you might tell her, the small, unremarkable details of your life in the camp, the weather, which was rain, always rain, a soft, unceasing rain that had fallen for so long you could scarcely remember what the sun felt like, the food, which was gruel and hard bread and watered wine, the same meals repeating in a slow, endless cycle, the color of the soil, which was a dark, rich brown, almost black in places, a soil that grew nothing but mud, and the thin, tough grass that the horse ate. These were the facts of your existence, plain and ordinary, and they seemed, when you considered them, too small to send across the long miles to Toledo, too insignificant to trouble a sheet of paper with. You lowered the quill again, the nib touching the paper just below the date, and you prepared to write the first word of the greeting, but the word did not come. Instead, you found yourself looking up from the page, your gaze drawn to the edge of the awning, where the rain had formed a row of shining droplets, each one clinging to the canvas with a tiny, trembling grip. The droplets were all different sizes, some small and round, others larger and elongated, pulled downward by their own weight, and they caught the grey light and transformed it into small, bright points of silver. You watched a single droplet as it grew slowly, fed by the water that seeped down the canvas from above, and you saw how it quivered and stretched and finally, with a soft, soundless release, fell to the mud below. Another droplet immediately began to form in the same spot, a new accumulation of water that would follow the same slow path, and the cycle continued, patient and unending, a rhythm that matched the rhythm of your own breath. You looked back at the paper, the date still sitting alone at the top of the page, and you thought about writing something about the rain, because the rain was the one constant, the one thing that never changed, and your sister might find it interesting, or at least not entirely boring, to hear about the way the rain fell in Flanders, how it was different from the rain in Spain. But the words for this were elusive, slipping away from you whenever you tried to catch them, and you realized that you did not know how to describe the rain in a way that would mean anything to someone who was not standing beneath it. The rain was simply the rain, a fact of the world, and words seemed inadequate to the task, too small and too dry to capture the wet, living presence of it. You set the quill down on the bench, its tip resting on a corner of the paper, and you leaned back against the crate, your shoulders settling into the damp wood with a soft creak. The ink on the page was dry now, the date a permanent mark, and the rest of the paper was still blank, still waiting, a patient emptiness that asked nothing of you. You watched the rain jewel the edge of the canvas above you, the droplets forming and forming again, and you let your thoughts drift without direction, touching on the memory of your sister's face, on the taste of the watered wine, on the sound of the rook that had called from the mist that morning. The unwritten letter sat beside you, a silent companion, and the afternoon wore on in the same quiet, unhurried way that all afternoons wore on in this country of rain and mud and patient, enduring stillness. The ink in the pot had begun to thicken at the edges where it met the clay, a dark, viscous ring that would dry to a crust if you left it too long, and you knew that you should either write the letter or stopper the pot and put it away. You did not write, because the words were still not there, still hiding somewhere in the quiet of your mind, unwilling to be coaxed onto the page. Instead, you reached for the cork, which you had placed on the bench beside the ink pot, and you pressed it back into the neck of the vessel with a gentle, twisting motion, the cork squeaking again as it settled into place. The ink pot was now sealed, its contents protected from the damp air, and you set it aside, a small dark shape on the bench. The quill needed cleaning, its nib still dark with wet ink that would harden and clog the point if you did not wipe it, and you took a corner of the linen cloth from your maintenance kit and drew the quill through it, the fibers absorbing the ink and leaving the nib clean and sharp. The cloth now had a new stain, a dark spreading blot that joined the older stains of oil and powder residue, and you folded it carefully and returned it to your pouch. The quill itself you placed on the bench, its feather barbs ruffling slightly in the faint breeze that moved beneath the awning, and then you picked up the paper, the sheet with the date at the top and the vast, empty space beneath it. You looked at the date for a long moment, the letters you had written in your own hand, the record of a particular day in a particular place, and you thought about how this sheet of paper would remain mostly blank, a letter that was not a letter, a message that carried only a date and the silent, invisible weight of all the words you had not written. Perhaps you thought you would add to it tomorrow, or the day after, when the words came more easily and the rain had stopped and the world seemed less resistant to description. Or perhaps you would never add to it, and the paper would stay folded in your knapsack, a small, unfinished relic of a quiet afternoon, until the damp and the passage of time reduced it to a soft, illegible fragment. Either outcome was acceptable, because neither was urgent, and the afternoon was long and still and asked nothing of you. You folded the paper carefully along its old creases, the coarse surface crackling softly, and you tucked it back into your knapsack, where it settled against the spare shirt and the folding knife and the small bundle of other letters you had received and read many times, their ink faded and their pages soft from handling. The knapsack's drawstring closed with a quiet, final sound, and the unwritten letter disappeared into the general darkness of the bag, becoming once again a possibility rather than an object. The quill you picked up last, its feather light and dry, and you carried it with you back to the tent, where you placed it on the small ledge of the center pole, next to the wooden crucifix and the spare match cord. It lay there, a pale, slender shape, ready for the next time you decided to write, whenever that might be. You returned to the bench beneath the awning, the rain still falling with its quiet, endless persistence, and you sat down with your back against the crate, your hands resting on your thighs, your eyes gazing out at the grey, misty world beyond the edge of the canvas. The afternoon had not yet begun to fade toward evening, the light still pale and even, the camp still quiet, the mud still gleaming with a faint, wet sheen. You had written nothing, and yet the hour had passed, and you felt no regret, no sense of a task undone. Only the quiet, familiar peace of a moment fully inhabited. A moment in which nothing happened and nothing needed to happen. and the rain fell, and the ink dried, and the unwritten letter remained an unfinished thought, drifting gently on the slow current of the day. The final watch began as the grey afternoon dimmed into a wet evening that was identical in every particular to the evening that had come before it, and the one before that, stretching back through the long chain of days that made up your service in this country. The light drained from the sky so gradually that you could not mark the moment when day became twilight, or twilight became night, only that at some point you looked up and saw that the poplars at the edge of the field had become dark vertical lines once more, and the tents behind you had faded from pale canvas to indistinct humps of deeper grey. The rain had not paused or strengthened or weakened in all the hours since you had sat beneath the awning with the unwritten letter, and it continued now with the same patient persistence, a soft, endless falling that tapped your helmet and soaked your cloak and turned the soil of the perimeter into a deep, clinging mud that grasped at your boots with every step. You stood at the edge of the camp, the arquebus cradled in your arms, the matchcord dry beneath your sleeve, and you watched the land dissolve into formless shadow with the same quiet attention you had brought to every watch before this one. The lantern on its post had been relit by the keeper on his evening round, and its flame cast a small wavering circle of yellow light onto the mud at your feet, a circle that seemed smaller tonight, pressed in upon by the weight of the darkness and the mist that was already beginning to rise from the saturated ground. The mist coiled around your ankles in slow, lazy currents, a low white vapor that glowed faintly in the lantern light and then faded into the blackness beyond, and it brought with it the smell of wet earth and the faint, clean scent of the rain itself. You stamped your feet once, a habit so ingrained that you no longer noticed yourself doing it, and the mud made a soft sucking sound as it released your boots and then swallowed them again. The cold was the same cold that had accompanied every watch, a damp, persistent chill that seeped through your cloak and doublet and settled into your bones with the patience of a tenant who had long since earned the right to stay. Time passed in the way it always passed during the watch, a slow, unmeasured current that carried you from one moment to the next without landmarks or milestones. You shifted your weight from one leg to the other, felt the rain trace a cold line down the back of your neck, listened to the distant, muffled cough of a soldier inside a tent, and watched the darkness beyond the lantern's reach with the calm, patient gaze of a man who expected to see nothing and was content to have that expectation met. The field before you was a blankness, a void that might have contained an advancing army or a grazing deer or nothing at all, and the not knowing was a part of the watch, a part of the stillness, a part of the quiet acceptance that was the watch's true purpose. You began the slow circuit after a time, not because the captain had ordered it, but because the rhythm of the watch demanded movement, a slow, measured patrol that would carry you past the familiar landmarks and back to your post in a loop that had no beginning and no end. The path was the same path you had walked on the previous watch and the watch before that, and your boots found the same ruts and puddles with the unthinking accuracy of long habit. You passed the large tent where the men slept, their breathing a low rhythmic murmur beneath the canvas, and the stacked pikes that leaned against their wooden frame, their metal points glinting faintly with a sliver of reflected lantern light, and the shallow pond that had spread even further during the day until its edges lapped at the path itself, forcing you to step wide around it. The mud grasped at your boots with each step, a heavy, reluctant grip that slowed your pace and made each movement a small, deliberate act. And you accepted this, as you accepted everything else, without resistance and without complaint. The supply wagons loomed out of the darkness as you rounded the bend, their dark bulk unchanged, their canvas covers lashed tight against the rain. The loose rope you had noticed on the previous night had been secured at some point during the day, its end now tied neatly to a wooden cleat, and the fact registered in your mind as a small, quiet note of order restored, a thing that had been out of place and was now in its place once more. The horses stood in the picket line beyond the wagons, their heads low and their bodies motionless, the steam of their breath rising in faint pale plumes that were swallowed by the mist. One of them shifted its weight as you passed, a hoof squelching in the mud, and a low, rumbling sound came from its chest, a sound that was not quite a whicker, not quite a sigh, simply the noise of a large animal acknowledging your presence in the dark. You walked on, and the horse returned to its stillness, and the night closed around it once more. The circuit continued, past the armorer's tent with its faint metallic smell, up the low mound where you paused to look out over the camp, a scattering of lantern lights that floated in the mist like small captive stars, and down again into the deeper darkness of the rear perimeter where the ground was rougher and the puddles deeper. You navigated around them by memory, your feet knowing where the ground was firm and where it would give way, and the rain fell on your helmet and your shoulders with its steady, unvarying rhythm. The ditch at the far edge gurgled with its own quiet voice, the water moving through it with a low, liquid sound that was different from the patter of the rain, and you followed it for a distance before the path turned again and led you back toward the center of the camp. The circuit was a loop, a circle that closed upon itself, and you walked it with the dreamlike, automatic attention of a man who had walked it so many times that the walking had become a form of stillness, a meditation in motion. By the time you returned to the lantern post, the first circuit was complete, and you paused there for a moment, your hand resting on the damp wood of the post, your eyes scanning the darkness with the slow, methodical sweep of the watch. Nothing moved, nothing sounded, and so you turned and began the circuit again, the second pass retracing the steps of the first with the same unhurried pace. This time, the details of the camp seemed softer, less distinct, as though the mist and the rain and the darkness had conspired to blur the edges of everything, turning the world into a watercolor painting in which shapes bled into one another, and the only clear thing was the sound of water on canvas and mud, and the steady, patient rhythm of your own breathing. The second circuit passed without event, and the third and the fourth, each one a repetition of the last, so identical that they merged in your memory into a single, continuous walk that might have lasted minutes or might have lasted hours. You had no way of telling and no desire to know. The cold had settled into your feet and hands, a dull, distant ache that was more a condition of existence than a discomfort, and your shoulders had grown accustomed to the weight of the arquebus, the wooden stock, a familiar pressure against your hip. Your thoughts, which had drifted during the earlier circuits through memories of the olive grove and the unwritten letter and the taste of the morning gruel, had now grown quiet, the images fading until there was only the walk and the rain and the quiet, empty peace of the watch. At some point during the fifth circuit, or perhaps the sixth, you became aware of a change in the texture of the darkness ahead, a subtle thickening that separated itself from the general blackness and resolved, by slow degrees, into the outline of a man. It was Alonso, emerging from the mist as he had emerged the previous night and the night before that, his cloak heavy with water, his helmet catching the faint gleam of the distant lantern as he drew close. He walked toward you with the same slow, deliberate gait he always used, his boots squelching in the mud, and he stopped a pace away, close enough that you could see the water beading on the bridge of his nose, and the way his moustache was plastered flat against his lip. He did not speak, because speaking was not yet part of the ritual, and you did not speak either, because you understood the rhythm of these exchanges as thoroughly as you understood the rhythm of your own heart. The moment arrived with a slight lift of Alonso's chin, and you spoke the first half of the watchword in a voice so low it was barely a murmur, the single syllable of the saint's name that had been chosen by the captain and repeated at every change of the guard. Alonso answered with the second half, his voice a low rumble that seemed to come from somewhere deep in his chest, and you reached inside your cloak to retrieve the scrap of paper, now soft and fragile from a full day of dampness, and you passed it to him. He took it with a nod and tucked it into his own cloak without looking at it, and the ritual was complete. The torch of watchfulness passed from your hand to his with the same quiet ceremony that had marked its passing 100 times before. A mild sensation passed through you then, a loosening of something that had been held tight for hours, and you recognized it as relief, a relief so subdued and undemonstrative that it barely deserved the name. It was not happiness, not satisfaction in any warm or glowing sense, but simply the quiet knowledge that the watch had been kept, that nothing had happened, that the camp had remained still and dark and peaceful under your gaze, and that you could now set down the burden of attention and let another carry it for a while. The feeling was similar to the sensation of removing a heavy pack after a long march, a gradual easing of pressure rather than a sudden release, and it spread through your shoulders and down your spine as you turned away from the lantern post and began the short walk toward your tent. The walk was familiar, every step known, every puddle anticipated, and you moved through the darkness with the slow, heavy tread of a man whose body was already preparing for rest. The cook's fire pit was a dark pool of water and ash as you passed it, the hiss of the rain on the cold embers, a soft, familiar sound that accompanied you for a few paces and then faded behind you. The canvas of the tents brushed against your shoulder as you walked between them, leaving a trail of moisture on your already sodden cloak, and the only light was the faint, diffuse glow of the lanterns that filtered through the wet fabric, reducing the world to shades of deepest grey. You found your tent by memory, its shape identical to every other tent but known to you by some instinct that required no thought, and you ducked inside, the flap brushing against your helmet with a wet, heavy sound that was muffled by the rain. The interior of the tent was dark and still, and smelled of damp straw and old wool, and the faint, lingering odor of the men who slept there. You stood just inside the entrance for a moment, letting the quiet envelop you, and then you began the slow, methodical process of removing your damp outer layers. The arquebus came first, leaned carefully against the center pole beside your knapsack and your boots, its barrel gleaming faintly with a dull, oiled sheen. The helmet came next, lifted from your head with both hands, its weight a familiar thing that you were glad to set aside, and you placed it on the ground beside your pallet, the metal cool and wet beneath your fingers. The cloak, heavy with water, required more effort, the clasp stiff and uncooperative, and you worked it loose with the patience of long practice, the wet wool sliding from your shoulders with a soft, heavy sound as it fell onto the straw. The breastplate, which you had worn beneath the cloak, was cold and damp against your doublet, and you unbuckled it with slow, deliberate movements, the leather straps releasing with a faint, wet creak, and you set it aside, the metal dark and glistening with condensation. You were left now in your doublet and breeches, the clothes still damp but lighter, less burdened, and you knelt on the straw pallet and began to arrange your bed for the night. The blanket, which had been folded in the corner, was still damp, but you shook it out and spread it over the straw, smoothing the wrinkles with the palm of your hand. The straw rustled beneath the wool, a dry, papery sound that was loud in the quiet of the tent, and then the sound faded and the quiet returned, deeper than before. You lay down on the pallet, your body sinking into the straw with a soft, yielding sensation, and you drew the blanket up to your chin, the wool rough and cool against your skin, but gradually warming as your body heat seeped into it. Around you, the other soldiers breathed in their slow, steady rhythms, the same rhythms you had listened to the night before and would listen to again the night after. Vargas snored softly, a low, rasping sound that rose and fell with the regularity of a pendulum, and Herrera murmured something in his sleep, a word you could not catch, and the man whose name you rarely remembered was silent. A dark shape curled on his side. The rain drummed on the canvas above you, a soft, continuous murmur that filled the tent and pressed gently against your ears, and you listened to it with the quiet attention of a man who had been listening to rain for so long that it had become a part of him, a sound that meant safety and shelter, and the end of duties. Your body, which had been tense with the cold and the alertness of the watch, began to relax by slow degrees, the muscles of your shoulders and back releasing their grip, your legs growing heavy and still beneath the blanket. The cold that had settled into your feet and hands was still present, a dull, distant ache, but it no longer troubled you, merely another sensation among the many sensations of the night, and you let it be, accepting its presence as you accepted the presence of the rain. Your breathing slowed, deepening into a rhythm that matched the rhythm of the canvas above you, and your thoughts, which had been quiet during the watch, grew softer still, the images and impressions that surfaced in your mind becoming indistinct and fragmentary, like the shapes in the mist beyond the perimeter. You thought for a moment of the olive grove in Extremadura, the silver-green leaves shimmering in the heat, but the image was faint and distant, a pale ghost of a memory that dissolved as soon as you tried to hold it. You thought of the unwritten letter, the date sitting alone at the top of the page, but the thought was weightless and without urgency, a small, quiet fact that would still be there in the morning. You thought of the mud and the rain and the patient, enduring ox, but the thoughts were soft and blurred, merging into one another and then fading into the general quiet of your mind. The rain filled the spaces where your thoughts had been, a gentle, all-encompassing sound that asked nothing of you and offered nothing but its own steady, peaceful presence. The lantern outside the tent still burned, its light filtering through the canvas in a pale, diffuse glow that was just enough to see by if you opened your eyes, but you did not open your eyes because the darkness behind your eyelids was softer and deeper and more restful. The sound of the rain grew distant, as though it were falling not on the canvas above you but somewhere far away. A gentle, murmuring voice that spoke a language you did not need to understand. Your breathing slowed further, each inhalation a long, slow tide that rose and fell, each exhalation a release that carried with it the last faint traces of the day. The weight of the blanket was a comfort, the straw beneath you a cradle, the breathing of your companions a lullaby, and you drifted on the edge of sleep, suspended in the quiet, dark water between waking and rest. The world of the camp, the mud and the rain and the lanterns and the patient horses standing in the mist, receded from your awareness, becoming a distant, muted backdrop to the soft, internal landscape of approaching sleep. The watch was over, the cycle complete. The long, quiet night passed without event, and you had done what you were meant to do, stood where you were meant to stand, watched what you were meant to watch, and now the only thing left was this, the slow, gentle sinking into the deep, dreamless peace that waited beneath the sound of the rain. Your thoughts dissolved into sensation, the sensation dissolved into stillness, and the stillness at last gave way to the heavy, comfortable pull of sleep, a sleep as deep and quiet as the rain itself, falling endlessly on the dark fields of Flanders.